Hello everyone, welcome to Enigma Vault. I hope my voice and stories can be the bridge between your racing thoughts and peaceful sleep. If this journey can soothe you, please like and subscribe to my channel. You are safe here. Let the story begin. The passageway was shaking more violently than before. Irene's eardrums were hurt by the groaning of the rock wall. Colin's arms were as tense as iron as he protected her, and his knuckles left red marks on the back of her waist. This was a sign that he was trying hard to restrain his dear spirit personality. She could hear the suppressed moans in his throat, mixed with the sound of gravel falling overhead, which sounded very much like the cries of the fawn whose leg was broken by a trap outside the summer camp tent 20 years ago. Triangle area. Hide in the triangle area of the rock crevice. A rough roar cut through the chaos. Irene looked up and saw a figure carrying a shotgun rushing out from the depths of the crack. It was Hunter Jack. His bronze face was stained with pine resin, and the barrel of his gun was dripping with fresh pine oil. He had obviously just come from the pine forest near the fire. The trajectory of the boulder falling is a parabola, and the angle between the rock cracks is the safest. He pulled the nearest Harry to the left rock wall, and his hunting boots crushed sparks on the gravel. Colin suddenly stumbled half a step. Irene immediately noticed that the temperature of his palms was soaring. This was a sign that the deer spirit was about to awaken. His pupils were shrinking at a speed visible to the naked eye, and veins were bulging at the corners of his eyes, as if the consciousness of some wild animal had forcibly torn open the gap in his rationality. "Colin, listen to me." She stood on tiptoe and put her ear to his ear. The smell of pine resin mixed with cedar perfume on his neck penetrated into his nose. This was the calming fragrance she specially made for him. Remember last week in the consultation room, we counted the pine needles, starting from 10 and counting backwards. 10. Colin's voice trembled, and the sweat on his forehead hit her collarbone. 9. A rock as big as a millstone brushed past their left shoulder and fell, blasting rock chips onto the ground. Jack swung the lasso from his waist, accurately caught the shaky bone bell in Harry's arms, and dragged the old man into the crevice. Kevin was curled up on the other side, shining the flash of his mobile phone at the crack above his head. He always said that a reporter's instinct is to record, and that cannot be changed even when running for one's life. 7. Colin's fingers suddenly dug into Irene's lower back with enough force to almost cause bruises. She gasped in pain, but instead she hugged his back even tighter. His shirt was soaked with cold sweat, and the muscles under the fabric were twitching uncontrollably, as if a trapped beast was bucking under his skin. She remembered that when she first met him 3 months ago, he cut his arm with a knife in the consulting room, and said, "The deer spirit is biting me." At this moment, the madness was oozing out from every inch of his skin. 6. The passage suddenly made a muffled sound, as if a giant hand had lifted the lid from the ground. Irene's stomach suddenly tightened, and a feeling of weightlessness almost made her fall down. It was not shaking, but the entire rock wall was tilting. There was a crack in the rock wall on the left that was as high as a person. A strong wind blew out of the dark, deep hole, carrying the smell of rotten leaves and burning resin, and it was like a giant vacuum cleaner that was trying to suck everyone in. Grabbed at the bulge, Jack's shotgun hit the rock wall, sparks flying into his eyes. Kevin, Lahari's belt. Irene's nails dug into the cracks in the rock. Her fingertips were cut by the gravel, and the taste of blood spread on her tongue. Colin's deer spirit personality was completely out of control. His pupils turned completely into vertical lines. A low roar came from his throat, and blue-black blood vessel lines appeared on his arms, which looked very much like the branches of a deer antler. He suddenly let go of her, and staggered towards the crack. The wind lifted the corner of his clothes, revealing the old scar on his lower back. It was caused by his brother using the handle of a deer antler knife before he committed suicide. "Colin!" Irene screamed and tried to grab his wrist, but he threw her back against the rock wall, There was a dull thud on the back of her head, and her vision went dark. She vaguely saw that his fingertips had grown sharp cuticles, leaving harsh scratches on the rock wall. Jack rushed over to help, but was knocked into Kevin by the sudden backflow of air, and the three of them rolled into a ball. "The dear spirit wants to go home." Colin's voice became hoarse, with double syllables. "It has been waiting for 20 years. Irene touched the shell in her pocket. It was the sedative potion Harry had given her, mixed with resin and a countermeasure to hallucinogenic spores. She gritted her teeth and climbed up, blood dripping from her forehead into her eyes, blurring her vision. Colin had already reached the mouth of the crack, and the wind rushed into his collar, pulling him into the black hole. She lunged forward and rubbed the green paste from the shell onto the vein at the back of his neck. "Ugh!" Colin howled like a beast and his body shook violently. The cuticle on his fingertips began to peel off, and his vertical pupils slowly shrank back to the shape of a human. Irene took the opportunity to hug his waist, and they both fell to the ground, pushed by the airflow to slide towards the crack. "Grab this." Jack's roar was close at hand. Irene looked up and saw that he was holding up a pine branch, as thick as his arm, with fresh pine needles hanging on the top. Obviously it had just been broken off from the cracks in the rock at the mouth of the fissure. He thrust the branch hard into the rock wall beside them. The resin immediately seeped out, gluing the branch to the rock. "Hold tight." Irene grabbed the branch, and Colin reluctantly reached out. Kevin and Harry rushed over from behind, and the weight of the four of them made the branches creak. The sound of the wind in the crack became louder and louder. Irene heard the swallowing sound of some creature from deep inside, mixed with the gurgling sound of boiling resin. Was that the real body of the dear spirit? Is the resentment that was buried under the camp 20 years ago now awakening through this passage? After an unknown amount of time, the shaking suddenly stopped. The wind seemed to be cut off by an invisible hand. The black hole at the mouth of the crack began to close, and the faint green light seeping from the rock wall gradually faded. Colin collapsed in Irene's arms, cold sweat soaking both of their clothes. Jack wiped the blood off his face, pulled the shotgun over, and checked the barrel. "We have to leave here quickly. The structure of the passage is as brittle as a pancake. If it shakes a few more times, it will collapse into a coffin. Treat the wound first." Kevin held up the flashlight of his cell phone to Aaron's forehead. "You need 3 stitches for this cut." Irene stared at the scar on Colin's lower back. A light green mark had appeared there at some point, and its shape was very much like a deer antler. She took out the olfactory bottle she carried with her, and sniffed the scar. The smell of burnt earth mixed with the sweet smell of pine resin, and a faint hint of baby powder. That was the scent that the suicide girls always loved to use. 20 years ago. "Let's go." Jack carried Harry on his back. "I know a secret way back to the camp." As they supported each other out of the passage, the morning mist was drifting over the pine forest. A faint sound of piano drifted from the direction of the camp. It was the old piano that Captain Maggie loved the most. But Irene heard a clearer sound, the long call of a deer, coming from an abandoned wooden house deep in the camp. It was clearer than any other time she remembered, as if something dormant for many years had finally opened its eyes. The morning mist was like crushed cotton wool, carrying the bitter scent of pine needles and drifting into the camp. Irene's heels rolled over the dewy gravel, and she could hear her rapid heartbeat overlapping with the vibrato of the old piano. Maggie always loved to practice the piano in the early morning, and there was always an indescribable sluggishness in the sound of the keys, like rusty gears turning in the bones. But at this moment, the sound of the piano was too smooth, abnormally smooth, as if someone was imitating her fingering. "Erin." Colin's hand gently covered her back, and his sweat-soaked shirt stuck to their touching skin. "You're shaking." Only then did she realize that she was clutching the corner of her clothes, and her knuckles were turning white. When she turned around, she caught a glimpse of the antler mark on Colin's lower back. which glowed green in the morning light, like a piece of moss that had come to life. "Let's go to the medical room." She grabbed his wrist and walked towards the cabin. "Let's take care of your injury first." "Wait." Jack suddenly raised his shotgun and pointed the barrel at the birch forest on the left. "There's someone." A figure in a plaid shirt walked out of the morning mist. It was Mark that Kevin mentioned. This man had just arrived with the second group of participants 3 days ago. He always liked to hide in a corner and draw some twisted lines on a notebook with a pen. At this moment he raised his hands with fresh pine resin on his wrists. "I heard some noise in the passage, so I came to take a look." His eyes swept over the mark on Colin's lower back, and his Adam's apple moved. "You saw the deer spirit?" Irene didn't answer. She noticed that the tip of Mark's leather shoes was stained with dark red, not resin, but blood. The incandescent light in the medical room was humming. Lily was spreading a roll of brown paper on the wooden table. The edges of the blueprint were scorched, as if it had been snatched from a fire scene. "This is a sonic trap modified from a trap." Her fingertips traced the spiral pattern on the paper. "The deer spirit's hallucination relies on infrasonic resonance. The buzzer installed in the clamp mouth can interfere with the frequency." She turned to the second sheet. "This one is even more amazing. It's a resin bomb. The smoke released after ignition can neutralize hallucinogenic spores." I extracted a sample from Lucas's necklace. Colin sat on the examination bed while Irene used a cotton swab dipped in hydrogen peroxide to clean the wound on his forehead. He shuddered slightly when the alcohol cotton touched his skin, but his eyes fell on Lily's drawing. Maggie's correction therapy is actually using resin to seal the memory. "The night my brother committed suicide, she added pine resin extract to our hot cocoa. His Adam's apple rolled, so Irene can smell the pine resin. It's the sealed memory leaking out. But the deer spirit's target is not us." Kevin suddenly interrupted, holding up the scraps of paper he picked up from the passage. "I found this in the collapsed stone wall, a list of participants from 20 years ago." He pointed at the last name. "The girl who committed suicide is Emily Carter. And Mark." He looked up at the door, where Mark was standing with a tray in his hand. "Mark Carter is her cousin." The air suddenly condensed. Mark's tray clattered to the ground, and the enamel cup rolled to Irene's feet. He stared at the list in Kevin's hand, his face paler than the old newspapers on the wall. "Are you checking me?" "We are investigating Luling's motives." Irene bent down to pick up the cup and smelled the almond scent remaining at the bottom of the cup. It was cyanide. She calmly hid the cup behind her back. "You were there before Emily committed suicide." Mark took 2 steps back and knocked over the medicine cabinet, breaking the glass bottles all over the floor. "It's Maggie," he suddenly screamed. "She gave us that disgusting cocoa, saying it would make us forget our shame. But Emily refused to drink. She said she was going to call the police. And then He covered his face, tears seeping through his fingers. "I thought it was okay if I forgot about it, but when the deer rang, I saw her standing by the lake again, her hair dripping with water." "That's enough." Jack slammed the table, causing the blueprints to rustle. "The problem now is that the deer spirits have started hunting humans. John's throat was slit by a deer antler last night, and he died with pine needles in his hand, the kind that Maggie's correction room only has." Lily suddenly grabbed a blueprint. "So we need to set up traps around the correction room to cut off the deer spirit's energy source." Her fingertips poked a hole in the blueprint. "But we have to go to the warehouse to get the materials. There are buzzers and rosin blocks that I need. Jack and I will go." Colin stood up, the antler mark faintly visible under his shirt. "Erin will stay to comfort everyone. Kevin and Harry will guard the infirmary." He looked at Mark. "You'd come with us." The wooden door of the warehouse was hung with a rusty iron chain. When Jack used a hunting knife to pick the lock, Irene was standing behind the bushes outside the window. She saw Mark fall back half a step, his right hand quietly reaching for his waist. There was a small axe, which was the tool that Lily dropped at the entrance of the passage in the morning. Colin was looking for materials with his back to them. The antler mark became clearer in the morning light, like a green fire about to burn. Found it. Colin held up a metal box. Here are all the buzzers. Mark raised the axe into the air, and then slowly put it down. When he turned around, he caught a glimpse of Irene's shadow, and his pupils suddenly contracted. Irene took 2 steps back into the mist and heard Colin's voice coming from the warehouse. "Mark, you don't look well. Do you want to go back first?" "No need." Mark's voice trembled. I'll move the resin blocks." When they returned to the medical room with the materials, Lily frowned at the half-empty toolbox. "Strange," she said, searching for screws and wires. "I brought 3 boxes of nails, but now there's only half a box left." Irene's eyes swept over Mark's cuff stained with resin. There was a fresh scratch there, as if it had been made by a steel nail. She took out the enamel cup from her pocket. The almond smell was still there, but the sweet smell of pine resin was stronger. The sound of deer calling could be heard again in the morning mist, closer than before, as if it was lying on the roof. "We'll do it tonight." Irene pressed down Lily's blueprint. "See you in the correction room." Her eyes swept across Mark's trembling fingertips and fell on the messy toolbox. Half a box of steel nails gleamed coldly in the morning light. One of the nails rolled to the edge of the table and fell to the ground with a thud. Mark bent down to pick it up, and Irene saw the cold sweat on the back of his neck, like a string of pearls about to break. The morning mist, wrapped in the bitter scent of pine needles, drifted into the medical room. Irene's fingertips unconsciously stroked the rim of the enamel cup. The almond flavor formed a thin frost on the wall of the cup, mixed with the faint smell of rust on Mark's cuffs. It was the blood oozing from the steel nails that pierced his skin. She lowered her eyes to stare at her shadow on the table, and heard Mark's heavy breathing as he moved the resin blocks, like an old bellows that had fallen into disrepair. "Will we have enough nails for the trap in the correctional room tonight?" She flipped through the blueprints with a rustling sound, her voice filled with anxiety. Lily said she wanted to install barbs on the door lintel, but the toolbox, that's enough. Mark's Adam's apple moved, and when he bent down to pick up the steel nails, the cold sweat on the back of his neck slid down his collar into his spine. He touched the half-empty box of steel nails under the table, and a burr pricked his fingertips painfully. It was the box he had secretly stuffed into the pile of rosin while Lily was napping last night. I'll go look in the warehouse again. Maybe I missed it." Irene watched him stagger out the door and exchanged glances with Colin. The resin lamp held by the latter had wet marks on his palm, and the coldness unique to the Luling personality spread from the bottom of his eyes, but he suppressed it forcefully. "What is he waiting for?" Colin's voice was like crushed pine needles. "Maggie's signal, or looming. Wait until we relax." Irene opened the window, and the morning mist poured in, wrapping up the deer calls coming from afar. The sound was deeper than yesterday, like someone knocking on a pine tree trunk with his knuckles. She took out the deer antler necklace from her pocket. The hallucinogenic spores left by Lucas were slightly hot in the pendant. "Jack and Lily have already set up a net on the east slope. I changed Mark's escape route to that side." When the afternoon sun pierced through the fog, Mark appeared at the door of the medical room again. There were pine needles on his temples, and a fresh scratch on his cuff. "We didn't find the steel nails in the warehouse. Maybe they were knocked over by a wild deer." His eyes swept over Irene's pocket watch on the table. The hands pointed to 3:15, which was the final preparation time she accidentally let slip this morning. Irene clutched the blueprint tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Then what to do tonight?" "I'm going to the woods to pick up some pine resin." Mark rushed to speak, his voice rising 2 degrees. "Pick up more to reinforce the trap." When he turned around, he knocked over a wooden barrel in the corner, and the pine resin splashed on the ground, emitting a sweet and fishy smell. Irene watched him disappear into the pine woods, and nodded to Colin. "Let's get started." As dusk fell over the pine branches, A muffled roar was heard from the woods. Jack flashed out from behind the tree, the lasso still swinging in his hand. Lily ran over on dead branches, the wild berries in her hair, red from sweat. In the trap pit under their feet, Mark was struggling desperately. It was a net woven by Lily with steel nails and vines. The tips of the steel nails pierced through the mesh of the net, causing blood to ooze from his arms. "Are you crazy?" Mark's face turned red. "I'm here to help."
"Help steal the nails?" Irene squatted at the edge of the pit and held up the half box of nails.
One of them was stained with dark brown blood. "Last night, when you were rummaging through the toolbox, you cut your hand with a steel nail. Rosin can stop bleeding, but it can't stop the smell. The smell of rust on your cuffs is stronger than rosin." She touched her cuffs and said, "I deliberately leaked the time of action this morning, and you were in a hurry to report to Maggie, and you didn't even pick up all the steel nails in the rosin pile." Mark opened his mouth and suddenly started coughing violently. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The deer calls in the forest had changed. They were no longer clear long chants, but low howls, similar to human sobs. The pine leaves rustled, and a few swaying shadows flashed in the bushes 20 meters away. They are survivors controlled by the deer spirit. Emily's nails grow black thorns. John's eyes glow green, and their steps are mechanical and stiff, like puppets being pulled by strings. The deer spirit has activated. Colin's voice trembled. His pupils began to dilate and light blue blood vessels appeared in the whites of his eyes. That was a sign that the deer spirit personality was about to waken. Irene grabbed his wrist and pressed Lucas's antler necklace into his palm. "Hold on. We need you to wake up. Deal with Mark first." Jack pulled out his hunting knife and placed the tip of the knife against the edge of the trap. He attracted these ghosts. "No!" Irene stared at the approaching shadow and suddenly smiled. "If he can be lured here, he can be lured away." She turned to Lily. "Is your net on the east slope still usable?" "Yes." Lily understood immediately. "Use Mark as bait to lure them to the net area." Mark's face turned pale instantly. "You can't." "Yes." Irene interrupted him, untied the rope from her waist and threw it into the trap. "It will either be torn to pieces by the deer spirit, or help us delay time. Choose." Colin suddenly pressed her shoulders. His palms were hot, but with the unique coldness of a deer spirit. "They are coming." Irene looked up and saw the shadows in the twilight were getting closer. Emily's long hair was tangled with pine resin. John's fingers were dripping with black blood, and the same sound came out of their throats, like the whispers of countless people overlapping. "Blood oath. Blood oath. Tie him up." Irene threw the rope to Jack. "Lily, go to the net area to prepare. Colin and I will find the weakness of the deer spirit." She glanced at Mark's terrified face, and then at the approaching shadow. "Remember, if you live one more second, you can save one more person, including yourself." Mark's struggle suddenly weakened. He looked at the gradually clearer deer shadow behind Irene. His Adam's apple moved, and finally he stretched out his hand that was bleeding from the steel nails. Amid the sound of pine waves, the calls of deer and screams mixed together, Irene held Colin's hand tightly and could feel the two forces tearing at each other in his body. She took out the enamel cup from her pocket. The smell of almonds was completely covered by the sweet smell of pine resin. That was the smell of blood, and also the smell of breaking through. As the first controlled body broke through the pine branches and rushed over, Irene yelled at Mark, "Run!" Mark stumbled into the woods, shadows following him like a tide. Irene watched them disappear into the twilight, then turned to Colin and smiled, her smile filled with a desperate ruthlessness. "Now it's time for us to find the vital point of the deer spirit." The resin lamp lit up in her palm, illuminating the dark tide surging in Colin's eyes. Farther away, the cry of a deer suddenly rose, like a poisoned knife, cutting through the darkening night. Mark was pressing the tip of his tongue against his back teeth when the pine needles made a crisp sound under his feet. Jack's palm was still pressing on his shoulder, with calluses from years of holding a shotgun, pressing his shoulder blade so hard that it hurt. The beam of Kevin's flashlight split the night in front of him, and the light swept across the unhealed nail holes on his wrists. Those were left when Irene drove steel nails through his palms, saying it was to cut off the dear spirit's control chain. Now the blood clots were beating with his heartbeat, like some kind of awakened timer. Walk another 500 meters. Jack's voice, wrapped in the sound of pine trees, poured into his ears. I'll let you go when we reach the fir tree that was struck by lightning. Mark could hear his own heavy breathing, mixed with the faint sobbing in the woods behind him. The controlled survivors hadn't caught up yet, but he knew they were. Just like that night at summer camp 20 years ago, he hid behind the wooden board in the storage room, listening to the screams coming from the tent next door, and the resin embedded in the cracks of his fingernails slowly solidified into an amber cocoon. When Kevin's beam of light finally reached the charged tree trunk, Mark's nails had already dug into his palm. As soon as Jack's grip loosened, he stumbled forward, as if he were really trying to escape. But after running 30 steps, he deliberately tripped over a tree root, and the moment his knee hit the gravel, he caught a glimpse of the tactical knife Kevin had on his waist. The scabbard was covered with fresh pine resin, shining sticky in the moonlight. The whimpering in the woods was getting closer. Mark could hear the rustle of cloth against tree bark and something like the dull thump of a deer's hooves hitting the ground. He suddenly remembered the old diary he found in the camp warehouse 3 days ago. Maggie's father, the old battalion commander, wrote in red ink, "What the deer spirit wants is not blood, but the smell of repentance." When he stuffed the diary back into the bottom of the box, he smelled the turpentine seeping from the paper, mixed with the almond smell of the enamel cup in Irene's pocket, just like the almond cookies baked by his mother. Now he ran past a bush, deliberately letting the branches scratch his cheek. The moment the taste of blood spread over his tongue, he heard the dull thud of something heavy hitting the ground behind him. The first survivor who was controlled had fallen, probably tripped by the small branch he had buried when he pretended to stumble. Mark slowed down his pace and looked sideways. The outlines of the figures in the moonlight became clearer. Erica in a floral dress, pine needles tangled in her long hair. Taylor, who always wore a baseball cap, his eyes a strange blue under the brim, and the boy who disappeared in last year's summer camp. The front of his school uniform was stained with black blood. They weren't targeting him, Mark suddenly realized. Just like that stormy night 20 years ago, they gathered outside Lucy's tent when she committed suicide, not to comfort her, but to watch her put the rope around her neck. What Lu Ling wants is never the prey, but to see the prey struggle. He paused. The wind blew the sweet smell of pine resin into his nostrils, and he remembered the desperate fire in Irene's eyes when she held the pine lamp. She thought that using him as bait would divert Lu Ling's attention, but she didn't know that he had overheard her conversation with Colin 3 days ago. They were discussing that Lu Ling's vital point might be hidden at the original crime scene, and the original crime scene was the burned open space where Lucy committed suicide that year, now surrounded by Lily with steel cables and traps. Mark turned suddenly. He ran in the direction of the camp, mud kicked up by his heels hitting his calves. The whimpering sound behind me suddenly became louder. The controlled bodies began to accelerate, and the sound of dead branches breaking was like dense drum beats. He could hear his own heartbeat drowning out the sound of the pine trees, and memories from 20 years ago suddenly came flooding back. When Lucy handed him the group photo, there was a line of words written in lipstick on the back of the photo. "Save me," and he stuffed the photo into Erica's backpack. Because Erica said, "This crazy woman should be taught a lesson." Irene. Colin's voice trembled with suppression. He gently pressed his palm on the back of Irene's neck and led her behind the tree. In the halo of the resin lamp, his pupils were slowly shrinking. This was a sign that the deer spirit personality was about to awaken. Irene could feel the warmth of his palm seeping through her shirt, mixing with the heat of the resin lamp, like a fire that was not burning very well. "Hold on." She looked up at him, her fingertips gently pressing against his chin. I can smell that the scent of the deer spirit is getting weaker. In fact, she was not telling the truth. Just now when I passed the bush of evening primrose with white flowers, the resin lamp shone on the sticky liquid on the leaves. Those were hallucinogenic spores, exactly the same as those on Lucas's necklace. What made her even more uneasy was that the smell of blood in the wind suddenly became stronger. It was not fresh blood, but old blood mixed with scorched earth and ashes from burning pine needles. Colin's fingers suddenly tightened and pressed on the old scar on her waist. It was left when she was 12 years old and witnessed being pushed down the stairs by a school bully. "Do you smell it?" His voice lowered, with a hoarseness that didn't belong to him. "Someone is sabotaging the trap." On the other side, Lily was squatting next to the trap and adjusting the spring. Harry's silver cross gleamed at her feet, and the old man muttered something, and the dry branch in his palm ignited a faint blue flame. The resin should be applied to the inside of the teeth. Lily used a dagger to pick up a ball of semi-solidified resin. The control of the deer spirit is spread through spores. The resin can dissolve the outer shell of the spores. Wait. Harry suddenly grabbed her wrist. There was black dirt in the cracks between the old man's fingernails. It was the purified soil dug from deep in the tunnel. He raised his nose and sniffed the air like a hound. The smell of blood has changed direction. Lily's neck instantly broke out in goosebumps. She followed Harry's gaze and saw more than 20 shadows breaking through the bushes in the woods outside the camp. The figure in the lead was very familiar to her. It was Mark, who was supposed to be the bait. His shirt was torn by branches, and there were bloodstains on his face, but there was a kind of crazy smile at the corners of his mouth. Behind him, the controlled survivors stumbled forward. At their feet, the steel cable that Lily had buried half an hour ago was torn to pieces. The spring of the trap hung limply, and the resin on the teeth had been rubbed clean. Erin's sense of smell detected danger before her eyes. The smell of scorched earth suddenly became strong, mixed with the sweet fishy smell of stale blood, like a basin of cold water poured over one's head. She turned her head sharply and saw Mark's figure breaking through the last bush, and the shadow behind him flooded over the wooden fence of the camp like a tide. Colin's fingers tightened on her waist, and she could feel the deer spirit in him stirring, like a wild animal that had been awakened. "The trap has been destroyed." Lily's voice exploded from the intercom, with an electric noise. "Mark is back with them." Irene's pupils suddenly contracted. She looked at Mark's face getting closer and closer, and suddenly remembered the file of the sexual assault case. 20 years ago. Mark was an eyewitness at the time, but he remained silent when questioned by the police, and now the madness in his eyes overlapped with the dark shadow, with antlers in the photo of that year. The resin lamp burned in her palms, and the smell of almonds suddenly penetrated the sweet smell of blood and surged up. It was the smell of almond essence on the envelope when Lucy wrote to her for the last time before she committed suicide. "Colin." She held the back of his neck, and rested her forehead on his collarbone. "I'll protect you this time." Mark paused at the edge of the camp. He looked at the lit resin lamp behind Irene, and suddenly opened his arms, as if embracing some invisible existence. The controlled survivors let out ragged whimpers and began to scale the wooden fence. The moonlight shone through the pine branches onto Mark's face. The corners of his mouth widened, revealing his back molars stained with blood. Half a chewed hallucinogenic spore was hidden there, floating towards the camp with his breath. Irene reached for the dagger at her waist, and the touch of metal calmed her down. She could hear her own heartbeat, overlapping with Lucy's last heartbeat. 20 years ago, the wind suddenly changed direction, and amid the sweet smell of pine resin, she could smell a faint minty scent. That was the flavor of Colin's throat lozenges, with his unique warmth. "Prepare for battle," she said into the intercom, without a tremor in her voice. "This time, we won't let anyone be sacrificed." Mark's laughter, mixed with the calls of deer, pierced the night. He raised his hand and pointed to where Erin was. The captured survivors screamed and the wooden fence groaned under the weight of their impact. And in the woods farther away, a long deer cry suddenly sounded, clearer than any previous time, like some kind of ritual horn, tearing apart the darkness that was about to fall. The moonlight was cut into pieces by the pine branches and sprinkled on the wooden fence of the camp. The survivors, controlled by the hallucinogenic spores, banged against the fences, causing them to creak. Their nails dug into the wood, making a teeth-grinding, scraping sound. Irene's fingertips were against the dagger at her waist. The warm light of the resin lamp swayed in her pupils, reflecting the rainy night 20 years ago. Lucy crashed into her tent, soaking wet, and what was dripping from the ends of her hair was not rain, but blood mixed with resin. Dust. Lily suddenly shouted in a low voice.
Irene followed her gaze and saw a grey mist rising from the trampled mud, rolling up and down as the crowd ran, like a layer of translucent gauze.
The tip of her nose moved, and the sweet smell of pine resin mixed with the fishy smell of soil. This layer of dust became a natural barrier. Jack, Kevin, Irene grabbed the intercom. Go to the Westwoods and collect dry firewood. The more the better. She stared at the gradually blurring figures outside the fence, her knuckles whitening. Use smoke to cover this layer of ash, so they can't see and it will be a mess. Jack responded with a heavy gasp. Got it. His hunting boots left deep marks on the ground, and the machete in his hand had already chopped off 2 dead branches. Kevin crouched down and crawled into the bushes. The dead branches scratched his cuffs, but he didn't even frown. He just stuffed the dry wood, wrapped in pine needles, into his arms. Irene knew that this mysterious visitor was always looking through old files, but at this moment his bent posture like a lurking wolf seemed more adapted to the wilderness than she had imagined. The moment the smoke rose, the entire camp was wrapped in a milky white cocoon. The crackling sound of burning pine resin, mixed with the popping of dry wood, made it impossible to open your eyes. The whimpering sound outside the fence suddenly changed its tone, and something heavy fell to the ground with a thump. It was Lily's trap. Irene saw her crouching behind a tree, her fingertips still hooked on a spider-thin hemp rope, which she had tied between 2 birch trees 3 days ago. At this moment, it was wrapped around the ankles of a tall man, hanging him upside down in the air. Well done. Irene smiled into the intercom, but before she could even smile, someone gently touched her back. She turned around and saw Colin standing in the glow of the resin lamp, sweat dripping from his forehead, but his pupils were clearer than ever. I can feel it hitting the door. He pointed to his temple, his voice trembling, but this time, I don't want to let it out. Irene reached out and pressed the back of his neck, the coolness of the mint candy flowing up her palm. She had found it in his pocket last week and said he always took one when he was anxious. You are more powerful than this, she whispered. Take them around to the back where the smoke will muffle their footsteps. Colin's Adam's apple moved, and he suddenly grabbed her wrist. His palm was hot, like a piece of red-hot iron. If I lose control, remember to stab here. He pressed her hand to his left breast, and his heartbeat could be heard through his shirt. Don't hesitate. Without waiting for Irene's response, he crouched down and rushed into the smoke. The controlled survivors were still banging on the fence in vain, when a few of them suddenly froze. Colin's whistle sounded from behind them, which was the assembly signal according to the old rules of the camp. When they turned around, Jack's hunting knife was pressed against the back of the neck of the man in front, and Kevin quickly removed the shoulder of the other man. Just as the situation was turning for the better, a sharp deer cry tore through the smoke. The sound was like a steel needle piercing the eardrum. Irene saw Colin suddenly cover his ears, and blood seeped out between his fingers. His pupils expanded into ink black in an instant, and the curve of his mouth corners was exactly the same as the black shadow with deer antlers in the photo from 20 years ago. The deer spirit personality awakened. No, Irene screamed and rushed over, but was grabbed by Lily. Look at Mark. The trap expert's voice was trembling. He broke free, Mark was indeed laughing. He didn't know when he crushed the second spore hidden between his teeth, and dark red blood foam was on his chin. The rope that had been tied to the tree stump was scattered on the ground, and at his feet lay Lily's vellum drawing, with the edges torn jaggedly. Trying to trap me. He bent down to pick up the blueprint, his fingernails scratching deep creases on the circle of death mark. I can dismantle your little trap with my eyes closed. The smoke began to dissipate, and the moonlight illuminated his distorted face again. Irene saw behind him that the survivors who had been restrained stood up again. Their eyes were glowing with a strange blue, as if they had been re-injected with souls by the deer spirit. Colin's figure had disappeared into the depths of the woods, leaving behind only a string of messy deer hoof prints extending in the direction of Mark. The charcoal marks on the drawing glowed coldly in the moonlight. That was the last line of defense that Lily had spent 3 months drawing. If Mark threw them into the bonfire, Irene's breathing suddenly stopped. She reached for the dagger at her waist, and the metal felt like burning pain through her palm, as if reminding her, this time the price of losing would not be Lucy, but everyone's soul. Mark had already started running, the blueprints rustling in his hands. Just as Irene was about to chase after him, she heard the sound of a branch breaking behind her. She turned around and saw Colin standing in the shadows. The spikes of his antler headdress gleamed coldly in the moonlight, and at the corner of his mouth was a bloody smile that was exactly the same as Mark's. The pine needles crackled beneath Erin's feet, and her soles rolled over the dewy pine resin. Suddenly, the familiar smell of burning came up, exactly the same as it had been during the summer campfire 20 years before. She ran so fast that the psychiatrist badge on her name tag hit her collarbone, causing her to wake up in pain.
Erin, Colin's voice came from the right. His hiking boots broke a dead branch, startling a few night owls.
The moonlight shone through the treetops, casting a mottled shadow on his face. The spikes of the antler headdress brushed against the pine branches, rustling the pine needles. Irene noticed that the veins on the back of his hand where he was holding the tactical flashlight were bulging, a sign that he was wrestling with the personality of deer spirit. Mark's panting suddenly got closer. 20 meters ahead, the traitor's figure knocked aside a bush of wild berries, and the blueprint in his arms looked like a white flag. Irene saw an unnatural bluish-purple color on the back of his neck. It was a sign of the deer spirit's erosion. 3 days ago they discovered that controlled survivors would have these snake-like patterns on their necks, like an invisible string pulling a puppet. Mark! Irene screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice bouncing off the pine trees. She recalled that when she was counseling Mark last week, the former football defender huddled on the sofa and cried, saying that when he held Lucy's legs, he heard her shout, "I have asthma medicine in my pocket." "You are not a monster," she handed him a tissue at the time. "You are just driven by fear." Mark paused, and the edge of the drawing curled up between his fingers. When he turned around, Irene gasped. His pupils were completely dilated, leaving only the whites of his eyes glowing blue, just like the survivors who were controlled.
They said, if they burned the blueprints, I'd be free.
Mark's voice was like a rusty gear. Lucy wouldn't stand at the head of my bed anymore, and her asthma medicine wouldn't fall out from under the mattress anymore. He suddenly laughed, saliva dripping down his chin onto the blueprints. "You know what? The night she died, I smelled pine in her blood, just as I do now." Irene's temple was throbbing. She reached for the dagger at her waist. The metal handle was still warm from her body temperature, but the moment she touched it, she remembered what Lucy's autopsy report in the morgue 3 months ago said. Resin particles remained in the respiratory tract. That was when the killer pinned her against the pine tree, and the resin seeped into her lungs. "You smelled it wrong." She lowered her voice and moved closer. The pine scent that night was the smell of Lucy's hair rope. She always used pine essential oil for hair care. I found empty bottles in her relic box. Mark's fingers trembled, and the drawing made a crisp sound. Colin took the opportunity to flank from the left, and the rubber texture of his deerskin soles left shallow marks on the mud. Irene saw his Adam's apple rolling, and knew that he was using the anchor method they had agreed on to fight the deer spirit, silently reciting his mother's last words before she died. "My Colin is a child who will build a wooden nest for a wounded robin." "You don't want to be free by burning blueprints," Irene continued, her shadow overlapping Mark's in the moonlight, "but by admitting that you heard Lucy's asthma spray drop on the pine needles when you held her down. You could have bent down and picked it up, just like you helped me pick up the pen I dropped in the consulting room last week." Mark suddenly screamed, and the drawing was lifted above his head. Irene saw sparks from the bonfire flickering 500 meters away. The fire was the bait that Lily had deliberately left, but at this moment it became the most dangerous existence. Colin's tactical flashlight beam swept across Mark's wrist, and Irene saw clearly there was a circle of resin wrapped around his wrist, and half a piece of dried fern was stuck on it, exactly the same as the first survivor who was controlled 3 days ago. "It's Maggie's corrective therapy." Colin's voice suddenly became low and hoarse, which did not belong to him.
Irene's heart sank.
The deer personality was trying to take over the body.
His antler. His wrist swayed slightly, and the moonlight refracted diamond-shaped spots on the spikes. She mixed pine resin with hallucinogenic spores and smeared them on your accomplices. What you thought you heard was the call of the deer spirit, but in fact it was the spores gnawing at your brain. Mark's eyes cleared for a moment. He stared at the resin on his wrist, his Adam's apple moving. Maggie said, "This is purification."
"Purification bullshit!" Colin suddenly shouted, the voice of the deer personality and the original voice tearing each other apart. Her father used this trick to torture Lucy, stuffing pine resin into her fingernails and saying, "Bad girls should be punished by pine trees."
"The bloody rosin you smell is actually Lucy's blood mixed with rosin when she was tortured." Mark's drawings fell to the ground with a bang. He stumbled back and bumped into an old pine tree, the bark peeling off. Irene took the opportunity to pounce over, and just as her fingers touched the edge of the drawing, Mark suddenly let out a sharp cry similar to that of a deer. There were more frequent noises coming from the direction of the camp. There was the dull thud of Jack's hunting knife hitting the tree trunk, the crisp sound of Lily's trap spring breaking, and the broken sound of Kevin shouting, "Watch out behind you," mixed with the inhuman screams that came one after another. When Irene looked back, she saw the controlled survivors standing in a circle in an open space, 20 meters away. A unified low-frequency vibration came from their throats, like some kind of primitive call. Harry suddenly emerged from the crowd, his wizard robe torn open, holding a bronze bell in his hand. "It's infrasound," he shouted as he ran, his voice torn into pieces by the vibration. They use throat resonance to produce infrasound, which has a synergistic effect with the spores. I need 3 minutes to adjust the bell frequency. Before he finished speaking, the survivors in the front row suddenly turned to Harry, their knees bent at strange angles, like the posture of deer running. Irene heard Colin take a breath and followed his gaze. Those people had faded red ropes tied around their ankles at some point, exactly the same as the prayer rope hanging on the wall of Maggie's office. "Blueprints." Colin's voice came back, with his usual warmth. "Erin, get the blueprints. I'll go hold Mark back." The moment Irene grabbed the blueprint, Mark's nails had already dug into her forearm. She gasped in pain, but she smelled it the moment it touched. The smell of rust mixed with the resin. It was fresh blood. Mark had sawdust stuck between his fingernails, the same kind of orthodontic wood chips that Maggie had in her desk drawer. "They're driving us crazy," she whispered into Mark's ear. "But you can choose not to be a puppet. Just like last Wednesday when you came into the consultation room and said, 'I dreamed that Lucy smiled at me.' That's the real you." Mark's fingers slowly loosened. Just as Irene was about to pull her hand back, the infrasound waves from the direction of the camp suddenly rose in intensity, like a steel needle piercing her temple. Her vision went dark, and she heard Colin's suppressed groan. The deer spirit's personality was obviously also affected by the infrasound. Mark's eyes turned blue again. He pushed Irene away and ran towards the campfire. The edge of the drawing left a bloody mark on Irene's palm. Just as she was about to chase after him, Colin suddenly stood in front of her. His antler headdress vibrated slightly in the infrasound, and two completely different emotions surged in his eyes. One was Colin's worry, and the other was the madness of the deer spirit. "Go to the camp," he said, his voice a mixture of two tones. "Harry needs you to use the psychiatrist's methods to stabilize the survivors while I go after Mark. Trust me, I can control it." Irene grabbed his wrist, and a hint of citrus scent suddenly seeped out from the burnt smell of pine resin. That was the smell of the hand cream that Colin often used, which belonged to his original personality. She let go of his hand, turned around and ran towards the camp. Behind her she could hear Colin's footsteps, a mixture of the chaotic sounds of deer hoof prints and human footprints. By the time she rushed into the camp, the infrasound had grown into a sharp buzzing sound. Jack's hunting knife fell to the ground, and he knelt on the ground with his hands covering his ears. Lily's trap was trampled to pieces, and she was tying the ankle of a survivor with wire. Kevin held his head, blood oozing from his forehead, but he was still shouting, "Harry is over there. He needs batteries." Harry squatted under the old pine tree next to the campfire, the bronze bell vibrating in his hand at high speed, causing blood to ooze from his palm. Aaron saw an old radio at his feet, tuned to AM 103.7, the channel where Maggie played corrections every Friday. "The frequency of the infrasound is 17 hertz. Harry shouted at the top of his lungs, his voice almost breaking. "It resonates with Maggie's broadcast. I need a source of distraction." Irene's eyes scanned the crowd. The controlled survivors were slowly approaching Harry, their movements becoming more and more coordinated, like a group of deer commanded by the same nerve. At the outermost edge of the crowd, Maggie was walking out of the shadows, holding a black remote control in her hand, with the same smile on her lips as Lu Ling and Mark. The infrasound suddenly became so harsh that Irene's eardrums were almost pierced. She reached for the mints in her pocket, an old way to combat PTSD attacks. But the moment she touched the candy wrapper, she heard a long deer cry behind her. The sound was louder than all infrasound waves, and had a sharpness that pierced the darkness. Irene turned around and saw Colin standing on the high slope at the edge of the camp, his antler headdress glowing coldly in the moonlight. Behind him, Mark was lying on the ground with the blueprints held against his chest, and in Colin's eyes, the blue light was brighter than that of any other survivor. Lu Ling's personality was completely out of control. Irene's nails almost dug into her palms. The moonlight shone through the pine branches, casting mottled shadows on Mark's face. The corners of the drawing in his arms were wrinkled, like a dying grey butterfly. She remembered that she had found this yellowed paper on the beam of the old warehouse 3 days ago, a handwritten record of the corrective therapy experiment by Maggie's father, with the ink soaked with rosin. When she got closer, a fishy smell of burnt earth and rust suddenly rushed into her nostrils, which was the smell of the summer campfire and night. "Mark, do you remember?" She lowered her voice, the coolness of the mint exploding on her tongue. "Last year on bonfire night you taught me to recognize the Big Dipper, and said that your sister always mistook the handle of a spoon for a deer's antlers." Mark's fingers paused, and the wrinkles on the edge of the drawing rose and fell slightly in his palm. Colin stood 3 steps away from him, on the right. The shadow cast by the deer antler headdress covered half of his face, but his dark blue pupils were like 2 will-o'-the-wisp fires that were about to burn through the night. The deer spirit personality was using these eyes to observe its prey. "At that time you always said." Irene took half a step forward, and the pine needles made a crackling sound under her feet. "You said that when you find your sister's diary, you will bury a time capsule under the tallest oak tree in the camp." Mark suddenly looked up, his eyes were bloodshot, and Irene caught a trace of tremor deep in his pupils. Those were the tremors of a 20-year-old boy, not those of a zombie controlled by infrasound. Enough, Mark roared and stumbled back, holding the blueprint above his head. You all deserve to die. It was you who made her. His voice suddenly choked, and he swallowed the second half of the sentence with his Adam's apple rolling. Irene saw new scratches on the inside of his wrist, exactly the same as the serrated marks on the package of hallucinogens that Maggie had injected into the survivors in the infirmary 3 days ago. Colin's knuckles were white. Luling's personality surged in his body, and he could hear the sound of resin boiling in his blood vessels. It was the mark left by that rainy night in 1999. Before his brother was pushed off the cliff, resin was gushing out from the broken tree trunk, mixing with blood and condensing into dark red scabs on his palms. At this moment the edges of the drawing in Mark's hand were stained with the same dark red. Was that his brother's blood? Give it back to me. When Colin spoke, there were two tones in his voice. One was his own hoarseness, and the other was the low hum of the deer spirit. Mark's whole body was shaken, and the blueprint left an afterimage in the moonlight. Irene's heart was in her throat. She knew too well the power of the deer spirit's personality. The last time he lost control, Colin bent the iron fence with his bare hands, and the sawdust and blood embedded in his fingers mixed together, looking very much like the patterns of a deer antler. No! Mark suddenly screamed and threw himself down the slope, pine needles cracking beneath his knees. Colin's pupils suddenly contracted, and the deer spirit personality took over his body. The moment he leaped out, the antler headdress brushed against the pine branches, startling a flock of night birds. The three of them were tussling together on the slope, and the drawings were being torn apart with a rustling sound. Irene saw Mark's nails digging into the back of Colin's hand, and blood dripped from between his fingers onto the drawing, blending with the original dark red. Stop! She rushed over to grab Mark's arm, but he pushed her back and hit her against the tree trunk. The smell of pine resin suddenly became strong, and her olfactory compensation began to take effect. The bitter scent of scorched earth, blood, and burning pine needles mixed into the smell of that rainy night in night. She saw herself 20 years ago, 8-year-old Irene huddled behind a tree, watching 3 older children push another girl's head into a mud pit. Resin flowed out of the broken tree stump and spread in the mud like a blood-red flower. Erin! Colin's cry brought her back to reality. Mark rode on him, grasping the drawings in both hands and pulling them apart. The fragile pages made a dying groan. Colin held Mark's wrist tightly with his left hand, but kept his right hand on the back of Mark's neck, fearing that he would hit the stone. The deer spirit personality roared in the depths of his consciousness, asking him to crush these treacherous hands. But Colin gritted his teeth, and the pain of his nails piercing his palms kept him awake. Mark was not an enemy, but another soul trapped by guilt and fear. With a crack appeared on the drawing. Erin's breathing almost stopped. At this moment she heard footsteps. It was not the light sound of pine needles being crushed, but the dull sound of hundreds and thousands of feet rolling over the ground at the same time, like the tide flooding over the beach. The controlled survivors poured out from the pine forest, their eyes the same dark blue as Colin's, their movements eerily coordinated, and leading them was a girl in a floral dress. She was the ghost of a girl who committed suicide in 1999 and had been trapped in the camp for 20 years. Mark suddenly let go. He looked at the crowd rushing in. Tears and snot stuck to his face. Save me. I don't want to become like them. Colin turned over and pulled him up, holding the fragments of the blueprint against his chest. Irene wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth and saw Maggie standing at the end of the crowd, the red light of the remote control flickering in her palm. The frequency of the infrasound suddenly increased. Her temples throbbed, and 2 images flashed before her eyes. One was Colin of the present, with blood on his antlers. The other was the boy from 20 years ago, holding his brother's gradually cooling body, with resin forming amber on his face. Back to back. Colin's voice still contained the low moan of the deer spirit, but Irene felt Colin's warmth from the strength with which he held her wrist. The circle of survivors was shrinking. The girl in the floral dress walked in front. Her feet made no sound when they stepped on the pine needles, like a floating shadow. The fragments of the blueprint made a slight rustling sound in Colin's arms, and Irene smelled the increasingly strong smell of resin, mixed with blood, which was the smell of secrets, sins, and the coming reckoning. Infrasound resonates like the cry of a deer in the distance, and the girl in the floral dress has already touched the edge of Colin's clothes. The bloodstains on the fragments of the drawing suddenly glowed like some kind of curse being awakened. Cold sweat oozed from the back of Irene's neck, and the pain of the infrasound waves vibrating inside her skull felt like being hit repeatedly by a blunt object. She could hear her own pounding heartbeat overlapping with Colin's breathing in her ears. The boy who had held his brother's body 20 years ago was now using his body temperature to build the last line of defense for her. "Mark, give me the drawings," she shouted at the top of her voice. The smell of rosin mixed with rust was suddenly so strong that it choked her nose. The young man, protected by Colin, was trembling all over, digging his fingers into the yellowed paper. "No, this is evidence. They said that as long as it is burned, my brother can rest in peace." The girl in the floral dress had her fingers wrapped around Colin's deerskin coat. Only then did Irene see her face clearly. Purple veins floated beneath her pale skin, and what was reflected in her pupils was not the pine forest at the moment, but the bonfire from 20 years ago. That was Emily, the girl who committed suicide that year. Her floral dress was soaked with pine resin and glowed a strange amber color in the moonlight. "Colin." Irene grabbed the tactical knife at his waist with her backhand. The CB Colin Black engraved on the handle hurt her palm. Colin's antlers suddenly made a light clicking sound, and a low moan of the deer spirit personality rolled out of his throat. "Stand back." But his other hand tightly grasped Irene's wrist, and his knuckles turned white. There was a dull thud of something heavy falling to the ground from outside the encirclement. Jack chopped the third man, who rushed over with his long knife. When the blade embedded in the man's shoulder blade, he cursed in vulgar Spanish. "These idiots can't even avoid the pine needle trap." Lily squatted on a tree branch, crushed the fluorescent stick between her fingertips with a snap, and the green liquid flowed into the trap along the vines arranged in advance. The controlled survivor stepped on the log coated with pine resin and immediately fell into a deep pit full of pine needles, as if he was stepping on soap. "There are 3 in the east," Kevin's voice exploded from the walkie-talkie. He was climbing on the watchtower to observe the overall situation. The mysterious visitor, who always wore his cap, pulled down low, suddenly opened his collar, revealing an old scar on his collarbone. Maggie's remote control signal source is in the old warehouse. His fingertips tapped quickly on the telescope. "Harry's over there. Harry." Irene felt a sudden sharp pain in her temple. She smelled it, not pine resin, not blood, but the smell of the wormwood that Harry always cooked, now mixed with the sweet smell of rust. She looked up suddenly and saw the cave where the wizards were through the gaps in the crowd. Harry was bending over to adjust a device made of a bunch of copper bells and pine branches. 3 steps behind him, a man in lumberjack clothes was holding up a dagger, and the blade was shining coldly in the moonlight. "Colin." Her voice broke. She grabbed Mark's wrist with her left hand and pulled him into her arms, while the tactical knife in her right hand drew a semicircle. Emily's nails scraped across her earlobe, leaving 3 bloody streaks on her face. Colin's antlers suddenly burst into a dazzling red light, and the low roar of the deer spirit personality made the surrounding pine needles fall. "Protect her." He pushed Irene into Mark's arms with his backhand, and faced the crowd that was rushing over. In the cave, Harry's fingers were still on the knot of the last brass bell. He heard footsteps behind him, too light, like the hands that had covered Emily's mouth 20 years ago. The old man's cloudy eyes suddenly lit up, and he grabbed the resin block at hand and smashed it against the stalactites on the top of the cave. Ding! The moment the resin block shattered, The copper bell string shook and made a slight buzzing sound. The dagger-like wind brushed the white hair at the back of his neck. Harry lunged forward, the device falling apart in his arms. Spores from the pine branches rustling onto the surface of the copper bell. The tip of the attacker's knife pierced the rock, and the sparks ignited the hay on his trouser legs. That was the fire starter that Lily had deliberately sprinkled around the cave. "Irin," Kevin's voice exploded again. "Something's going on with Harry." Irene wiped the blood off her face, and the frequency of the infrasound suddenly became a little disordered. She smelled it. The scent of wormwood mixed with blood was becoming more rapid, as if someone was desperately scratching her olfactory nerves. The red light of Colin's antlers dimmed. He turned his head to look in the direction of the cave. The low murmur of the deer spirit personality was mixed with Colin's panic. "Hurry, he needs help." Emily's hands were around Mark's neck. The fragments of the blueprint slipped through his fingers, and the bloodstains glowed a faint blue light in the moonlight. Irene bent down to pick it up, but the moment she touched the paper, she smelled the scorched earth smell of that rainy night 20 years ago. The smell of burning resin, mixed with the desperate cry of a young man. "Catch her!" Maggie's scream came through the infrasonic loudspeaker, and the red light of the remote control flashed wildly in her palm. When Irene looked up, she saw the woman who always looked kind taking off her wig, revealing densely packed electrode patches on her scalp. It turned out that the so-called corrective therapy has always been to control the human brain with electric current. In the cave, the attacker raised his dagger again. Harry curled up in the wreckage of the device, looking at the resin spores on the surface of the copper bell glowing strangely in the moonlight. He suddenly laughed and said in a voice that only he could hear, "I see. The key to the interference is not the sound, but the spores." The hairs on the back of Erin's neck suddenly stood up. She looked in the direction of the cave. In the smell of pine resin mixed with blood, there was suddenly a faint minty scent. That was the smell of Colin's throat lozenges, and it was wafting from where Harry was. She clutched the fragment of the blueprint and shouted to Colin, "We have to get to the cave. Harry is in danger." Colin's antlers made one last crisp sound, and the shadow of the deer spirit personality flashed behind him. He grabbed Irene's hand, his palms full of cold sweat. "I'll take you there. Mark, follow Jack and the others." Mark clutched the torn corner of his clothes tightly, and watched the backs of the two people rushing into the crowd. The bloodstains on the fragments of the drawing suddenly connected into a complete pattern. It was a map of the summer camp 20 years ago, marking the secret passage under the old warehouse, and the sarcophagus, engraved with a deer antler totem at the end of the secret passage. In the cave, the cold light of the dagger was about to fall. Harry's fingers gently touched the copper bell, and the resin spores floated in the air with the buzzing sound. In the distance, Irene's steps suddenly stopped. She looked towards the direction of the cave, and a faint blue that did not belong to the moonlight was reflected in her pupils. The frequency of the infrasound waves is completely disordered, and Maggie's remote control explodes in her palm. Irene smelled it. The mint scent mixed with the smell of rust was spreading at a very fast speed. Was the smell of blood. Harry's blood. Yes. The bushes at the entrance of the cave rustled as the tips of Irene's leather shoes just touched the wet rock wall. Colin's palm almost dug into her wrist. The tip of the deer's antlers glowed cold white in the moonlight, and the vague shadow of the deer spirit was crawling up the back of his neck. But neither of them cared about that at the moment. Irene's nostrils were filled with the smell of rust, as if someone had stuffed blood-soaked gauze directly into her breathing hole. The minty scent was suppressed at the bottom, but it was clearer than ever. It was the smell of the green arrow mints that Colin had stuffed into her pocket this morning, and it was now stuck in the folds of Harry's robes. "Careful!" Irene's screams mixed with the muffled sounds from deep in the cave. She saw the figure holding the dagger. It was Sam, the pharmacist who had just joined the party last week. At this moment, his pupils were an unnatural grey, like a puppet with his soul drained out. The tip of the dagger was only 3 fingers away from Harry's throat, but the old man was still staring at the copper bell at his feet, his skinny fingers hanging above the bell, as if waiting for a precise moment. Colin's antlers pierced the air first. He growled and used his shoulder to push Sam's arm away. Amid the crisp sound of metal hitting metal, Irene had already pounced to Harry's side. When she felt the warmth of the old man's hand, she suddenly felt a chill on the back of her neck. Sam's other hand had taken out a second knife and pointed it at her spine. Irene, Colin's voice was hoarse like torn cloth. Irene didn't look back, but her nose suddenly caught the smell of burning resin. That was the spore sac that Harry had given her before. She grabbed Sam's wrist holding the blade with her backhand, dug her nails deep into his pulse, and blew hard at the stalactites on the top of the cave when he felt the pain. Brown powder fell down and sprinkled on Sam's face. His movement suddenly stopped, and a grey mist in his pupils began to surge like a deep pool disturbed by a stone. Colin took the opportunity to grab the 2 knives and hit him on the back of the neck with the handles of the knives. Sam groaned and fell to the ground. His body curled up like a fetus, and a whimper like a fawn came from his throat. "Thank you." Harry's fingers finally touched the bell. The buzzing sound wrapped in resin spores exploded in the rock cave, and Irene's sense of smell suddenly became unusually clear. The smell of damp moss, the cold sweat mixed with pine scent on Colin's body, the faint smell of sedatives on Sam's body, and coming from the inside of the copper bell, a burnt smell similar to that of burning electronic components. "The jammer is almost done." The old man pointed to the wooden box at his feet, which contained the remains of Maggie's remote control. "After the infrasonic frequency is disrupted by the spores, there will be a gap in their control." But suddenly there was a dull thud of something heavy falling to the ground outside the cave. Irene and Colin looked at each other and rushed out at the same time. In the open space under the moonlight, Jack was stepping on Mark's wrist. Lily's noose was wrapped around his waist like a snake, and the trap nets woven with pine needles and vines were hung on his shoulders. The mucus oozing from the mesh was corroding his coat. That was soaked in poison ivy juice by Lily, and it would cause blisters if touched. "Blueprints?" Mark's face was pressed against the mud, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. "Do you think you can win by getting the blueprints?" The things in the sarcophagus had been taken away by Maggie long ago. The secret of 20 years ago. "Shut up." Colin's antlers pressed against the back of his neck, his voice as cold as an icicle. "Erin, check his pockets." Irene squatted down and took out half a blood-stained drawing from Mark's inside pocket. The burn marks on the edge of the debris were still warm. Obviously he had just burned it with a lighter, but it was extinguished in time by Lily's trapnet. As she unfolded the blueprint, the outline of the camp from 20 years ago became clear in the moonlight. The old warehouse, the watchtower, the cabin marked punishment room, and the entrance to the underground secret passage circled 3 times in red pen. Just below the cave where they were standing at the moment. "Found it." Irene clutched the blueprint tightly and looked up to meet Colin's eyes. The shadow of Lu Ling was still floating in his pupils, but at this moment the faint blue was fading away, like the receding tide. She suddenly noticed the blood on the tip of his ear. "Are you hurt?" The Lu Ling personality is struggling. Colin pulled the corner of his mouth and reached out to wipe the mud off her cheek. "It's okay." There was a crisp sound of breaking glass in the distance. Everyone turned their heads at the same time. The bonfire in the center of the camp went out at some point, and the survivors who were originally sitting around it were now staggering to their feet. Their eyes were filled with the same gray as Sam's. Some of them picked up the charcoal from the bonfire, some picked up the folding chairs, and the blonde girl in the front row was pressing a table knife against her wrist. That was Emily, the middle school teacher, who had just said last week that she wanted to completely let go of the past. The frequency of the infrasound has stabilized again. Harry's voice came from the entrance of the cave, and he walked over quickly with the wooden box in his arms. Maggie's backup device has been activated. Spore interference can only last 10 minutes, and there are 7 minutes and 17 seconds left. Irene smelled it, and the smell of rosin in the air suddenly became thick, as if someone had applied a layer of sticky resin in her nostrils. Colin's antlers began to heat up, and the shadow of the deer spirit gathered behind him again. This time it was clearer than ever, and even the cracks on the antlers could be seen clearly. They were left by his brother, who hit the rock when he committed suicide 20 years ago. "They're coming this way." Jack clenched his hunting knife, and the blade reflected more than 20 staggering figures. "Lily, is your trap still usable? I can hold on for 3 minutes." Lily was already squatting on the ground, quickly undoing the rope buckle around her waist. "But after that, then we will guard the entrance to the cave." Colin's voice suddenly became low, with the tail tone of the deer spirit personality mixed in, like two strings vibrating at the same time. "Erin, take Harry into the cave to activate the device. The rest of you follow me." "No." Irene grabbed his burning wrist, and the fragments of the blueprint left red marks on their palms. "We have to do it together." Colin's Adam's apple moved. The deer spirit behind him suddenly stretched out his hand, his fingertips almost touching the ends of Irene's hair. But the next second, the dark blue suddenly trembled violently, like the surface of a lake into which a stone had been thrown. Harry's copper bell rang again, and this time there was a sharp buzzing sound in the humming sound, which was exactly the frequency of Maggie's remote control. "The device is activated." Harry's eyes lit up. "The frequencies are beginning to overlap." "Their control," a scream interrupted him. Emily's knife had cut her wrist, and blood was dripping from between her fingers, drawing a crooked bloodline on the ground. But her expression was calm, even with a smile of relief, as if she was standing on the stage of a graduation ceremony, instead of being controlled by hallucinations to hurt herself. Irene's nose suddenly felt stinging. She smelled it. It was the smell of the summer camp 20 years ago. The sweetness of pine resin melted by the scorching sun, mixed with the unwashed sweat smell in the locker room, and at the bottom, the faint smell of girl's perfume. That was the favorite orange blossom scent of Claire, the girl who committed suicide that year, and it was now seeping out of Emily's wound. "They are in their memories." Irene's voice trembled. "The deer spirit personality is making them repeat the sins of the past." Colin's antlers suddenly made a crisp sound. He held Irene's hand and pressed her palm against his chest. "Do you feel it?" My heartbeat synchronized with theirs. Ling is connecting everyone's memories. He wants. We are all going to go to hell together. Harry's wooden box was beeping, and the frequency curve on the screen was jumping wildly. In 5 minutes, the spore interference will completely cover the infrasound. "Hold on, Erin," Lily screamed from the left. A man with an axe had broken through the trap net, and the axe blade chopped towards Irene's head with a sound of wind. Colin turned around suddenly and used his antlers to block the attack. With a sound like bone breaking, a piece of antler flew out and pierced the man's shoulder. He covered the wound in pain. Then grey mist poured out of the wound like a punctured balloon. More people gathered around. Irene saw herself back then, a 12-year-old girl huddled in the back of the classroom, watching 3 girls throw Claire's school bag into the trash can. She saw Colin, a 16-year-old boy standing at the door of the dormitory, listening to his brother's laughter as he was insulted. She saw Mark, a 17-year-old camper, hiding behind a tree, using a Polaroid camera to take a picture of Claire being pinned to the ground. "That's not real," Irene shouted, her voice mingling with the hum of a bell. "That's an illusion. We all made mistakes, but we can." A heavy punch hit her side. Irene stumbled and fell, and the fragments of the blueprint flew out. Colin roared and pounced over, the shadow of the deer spirit completely covering his body. At this moment, his eyes were pure blue, and light golden blood seeped out of the cracks on his antlers. That was the price of the multiple personalities being torn apart. "Catch it!" Harry threw the wooden box to Lily, and rushed over to pick up the blueprint. Irene saw that as soon as his fingers touched the fragments, they were stepped on hard by a foot. When she looked up, she met Maggie's eyes. The current battalion commander appeared behind the crowd at some point, holding a new remote control in her hand. The frequency curve on the screen had overlapped with Harry's device. Too late, Dr. Hawk. Do you think you can stop collective atonement? The sins they did not have the courage to confess back then must be washed away with blood today. Colin's antlers pierced the two men who pounced on him. His movements became more and more mechanical, and a faint blue light shone from beneath his skin, as if there was a fading moon hidden inside his body. Irene got up and tried to pull him out, but was dragged into the cave by Lily. The device will take 3 minutes to start. Lily stuffed the wooden box into her arms. You are responsible for entering the password. I will help Colin. The copper bell in the cave was still humming. Irene's fingers trembled on the keyboard. She smelled the scent of Colin's mints mixed with the resin spores, and the increasingly strong smell of blood. It was the deer spirit personality devouring his vitality. When the last digit of the password was entered, a heart-wrenching deer cry suddenly came from outside the cave. Irene looked up sharply. Under the moonlight, Colin's antlers had completely turned into a translucent dark blue, and the deer spirit had completely merged with his body. He stood in the middle of the crowd, and all the controlled survivors stopped moving, as if the pause button was pressed. Maggie's remote control screen suddenly went black, and she stepped back in horror, only to run into Jack's arms. Successful. Lily wiped the blood off her face and looked towards the cave in disbelief, but there was no focus in Colin's dark blue eyes. He slowly raised his hand and pointed in the direction of the cave, towards Irene. The deer's cry rang out again, this time with a biting chill, as if it came from that rainy night 20 years ago, from Claire's last desperate whimper before she committed suicide. Erin's finger hovered over the confirm button. She smelled that the rust smell in the mint scent was stronger, so strong that it almost choked her lungs. Blood flowed from the corners of Colin's mouth, but the faint blue light became brighter and brighter, so bright that she couldn't open her eyes. Erin, Harry's voice came from behind her. Press it. Otherwise, the crowd outside the cave suddenly moved. This time they did not attack, but knelt at Colin's feet like pilgrims. Maggie's remote control fell to the ground. The screen cracked into a spider web, but it was still emitting faint infrasound waves. Irene looked at Colin's raised hand, looked at the mist rolling in his dark blue eyes, and suddenly understood. Luling's personality had never been defeated. He just changed the way to make everyone voluntarily accept the punishment. And this time, even Colin himself became the executor of the punishment. The moment the confirmation button was pressed, the cry of the deer outside the cave suddenly rose, like a sharp knife cutting through all other sounds. Irene's eardrums were vibrating. She saw Colin's body begin to become transparent, saw Maggie slumped on the ground, saw Jack and Lily clench their weapons, and saw the controlled survivors slowly stand up, the grey mist in their eyes fading away. But what replaced it was something more terrifying than the grey mist. The fear after waking up, and the guilt that could not be avoided. As the wooden box screen lit up green, Colin's blue figure suddenly disappeared. He stumbled and fell, his forehead hitting the rock, and blood flowed along his brow into his eyes. Irene rushed over and hugged him, and smelled the familiar mint scent. This time, there was finally no smell of rust, only the bitter smell of pine resin, and the warm scent of the campfire that could never be washed off Colin's body. Is it over? Colin's voice was very light, like a feather falling on the snow. Erin was about to answer when she heard the sound of wood cracking in the distance. That is the direction of the old warehouse, and the entrance to the underground secret passage is slowly opening. The moonlight shone into the tunnel, reflecting the deer antler totem on the sarcophagus, and the fresh scratch on the sarcophagus lid. It was obvious that someone had just been here and left something behind. Irene's sense of smell suddenly became extremely sharp. She smelled a faint scent of orange blossom wafting from the tunnel, which was Claire's favorite perfume. And underneath that, there was another smell. cold and sticky, like solidified blood, but older and heavier than blood, like a resentment that had never dissipated in the past 20 years. Colin's fingers suddenly tightened, pressing against her back. His body temperature was dropping, and his voice took on the ending of the dear spirit personality. Erin, do you smell it? She smelled something from the sarcophagus, and finally woke up. The moonlight was torn into pieces by the clouds, and the campfire in the open space of the camp crackled, illuminating more than 20 swaying figures. Their pupils glowed a strange green, and like puppets being pulled by strings, they stepped on the pine needles on the ground and approached the wooden house in the center, where Harry and his jamming device were hidden. Irene dug her nails into her palms. She could smell rust in the air, the blood from when Jack had slashed the arm of his first attacker with his hunting knife, and deeper in the air, the bitter smell of pine resin mixed with the smell of scorched earth was surging, which was a sign that Colin's dear spirit personality was stirring. 3 on the left. Lily's tripwire. Colin's voice was hoarse like torn cloth. He picked up a red-hot piece of wood and threw it at the tall man who was rushing towards him. Sparks splashed on the man's face, but only a muffled roar came out of him. The controlled survivor was deprived of even the sense of pain. Lily ducked and rushed out from behind the tree. The copper bells on her fingertips rang softly. 3 bodies were tripped by the nylon ropes under their feet at the same time and hit the traps she had set up in advance. As the metal teeth bit into her calf, Irene smelled a stronger smell of blood, and her stomach turned sour. She reached for the sprayer at her waist, which contained the volatile liquid of datura, prepared by Harry, which could temporarily block the activity of the hallucinogenic spores. The device is 3 minutes away. Harry's shout came from the crack in the cabin's door. His shadow swayed wildly in the candlelight like a whipped top. Irene glanced at his neck under his white hair, which was covered in sweat, and his fingertips were flying across the circuit board so fast that they were almost invisible.
Kevin, right. Colin suddenly grabbed Irene's wrist and pulled her to the side. A rusty axe brushed her ear and chopped into the tree trunk.
Kevin rushed over from the other side, shining the strong flashlight in his hand into the attacker's eyes. It was a girl in a floral dress. It was Martha, who was crying to Irene about her childhood nightmare during the day. At this moment, the corners of her mouth were stretched to her ears, and the deer antler pendant wrapped around the axe handle was oozing dark green mucus. The spore concentration is soaring. Irene panted against Colin's back. Her sense of smell seemed to be cut by a sharp blade. She caught the scent of orange blossom floating in the wind, exactly the same as the one in the tunnel. It's Claire, she's helping Luthen. Colin's body jolted violently. Irene felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a sign that his dear spirit personality was about to awaken. But the next second he took her hand and pressed it against his heart. Listen to the heartbeat, Irene. I'm here. The steady and powerful heartbeat, mixed with the crackling of the campfire, temporarily suppressed the fishy and bitter taste of the pine resin. Irene looked up and bumped into his stubbled jawline. As her Adam's apple rolled, she remembered how he fell on the rock 3 hours ago. His blood was hot then, and now his palms were even hotter. The defense line is about to be broken. Jack's roar came from the left. The blade of his hunting knife was bent, and 3 claw marks on his body were bleeding, but he was still holding the arms of the 2 attackers with his bare hands. The controlled crowd was like the rising tide. Tripwires, traps, and datura sprays all became reefs that could only delay but not stop it. Start! Harry's roar mixed with the crackling sound of electricity. A faint blue light suddenly burst out from the window of the wooden house, and some extremely low-frequency sound waves caused the pine needles to fall to the ground. Irene's eardrums were stinging, but she could hear gasps coming one after another. Martha's axe fell to the ground with a clang, and the tall man squatted down with his head covered, tears seeping from between his fingers. It works. Kevin gripped the flashlight tightly, and the beam swept over the survivors who had regained consciousness. but the next second his pupils shrank suddenly. "Be careful." Old Tom in the front row suddenly straightened up. His eyeballs turned completely black. His neck was bent backwards at a strange angle, and a sharp cry like a deer came from his mouth. More people looked up, and purple veins bulged under their skin, like countless snakes crawling under their skin. The deer spirits were fighting back. Protective device. Colin pushed Irene towards the cabin, but he went towards Old Tom. The deer's cry made the air tremble, and Old Tom's nails suddenly grew 3 inches long, shining with a cold metallic light. Colin dodged to the side to avoid the vital parts, but his left shoulder was cut open with a bloody wound. The blood splattered on Irene's face, warmed with the smell of rust, but mixed with a hint of the familiar campfire scent. It was Colin, not Lu Ling. "You're crazy." Irene rushed over and sprayed Old Tom's face with the sprayer, in the bitter scent of datura. Old Tom paused, and Colin took the opportunity to grab him by the back of the neck and threw him heavily to the ground. "It's just a superficial wound." Colin tore off the corner of his clothes and wrapped it around the wound, but blood seeped through the rough cloth, shining brightly in the moonlight. Irene's fingers were shaking. She wanted to touch him, but didn't dare. But he suddenly smiled and said, "Last time you hugged me, I was still bleeding. This time, it's my turn to protect you." Before he finished speaking, there was a loud tremor in the wooden house. Harry staggered out, his white hair blown into a mess. Device overload. The deer spirit's counterattack is too strong. It's going to... The word explosion was interrupted by an even more violent vibration. The wooden boards of the cabin cracked into spiderweb-like patterns. The dark blue light turned into a blinding pale, and the frequency of the sound waves was so high that Irene's temples throbbed. Lily's tripwire suddenly broke. Jack's hunting knife fell to the ground with a clang, and everyone covered their ears and squatted down. Only the survivors controlled by the deer spirit were still moving forward. Their skin began to bleed, as if the cells were torn apart by the sound waves. "Run!" Kevin grabbed Martha, who was nearest to him, and dragged her into the woods. Jack carried the 2 survivors who had regained consciousness, and Lily ran while throwing traps behind them. Irene stood there watching Colin stagger towards the wooden house. There was still half a circuit board left there, which was Harry's hard work. "Colin!" She rushed over, but was blown against a tree by the gust of wind. Amid the flying wood chips, she saw Colin's figure being engulfed by white light, heard Harry's desperate scream, and smelled a stronger scent of orange blossom wafting from the direction of the tunnel, mixed with the fishy sweetness of rotting meat. That was the thing in the sarcophagus, and it had completely woken up. The hum of the device turned into a shrill scream, and Irene's sense of smell became clearer in the severe pain. She smelled the bonfire scent in Colin's blood, the sweetness of Claire's perfume, and the scorched earth, and tears of that night, 20 years ago. Something exploded in her mind, like a memory sealed in resin for 20 years suddenly melting away. The scratches on the underground sarcophagus are not new. It was scratched by the deer antler pendant she was holding in her hand when she was 10 years old and hiding behind a tree and witnessing bullying. "Erin?" Colin's cry was torn apart by the explosion. She suddenly opened her eyes and found that she had rushed towards the cabin without knowing when. The outer shell of the device was cracking, and green spores were floating in the blue light, like a group of crazy fireflies. Erin pressed her hand against the hot metal casing. The smell of rosin suddenly became strong. She smelled the dripping solder when Harry was debugging. The campfire scent in Colin's fingerprints just touched, and the sweat on her palms mixed with the bitterness of mandrake. And at the bottom, the ancient resentment was resonating with the sound waves of the deer spirit. "Calm down," she said to herself, her voice as soft as a sigh. The blast had begun to burn her eyelashes, but she suddenly saw clearly. Those green spores were dancing to the frequency of the sound waves, like the rhythm of dripping rosin, as Claire danced in her antler necklace at the summer camp party 20 years ago. Irene's fingertips were almost burned by the metal shell, but the smell of pine resin and mandrake became clearer in her nose. The blast blew up the strands of hair on her forehead. She looked at the green spores vibrating with the sound waves and suddenly remembered the old wooden box she had found in the camp warehouse 3 days ago. Inside it were neatly stacked materials left over from the summer camp 20 years ago. Pine resin blocks, dried datura petals, and half a box of solder wire. "Harry," she turned and shouted at the top of her lungs, her voice torn by the hum of the device. The gray-haired wizard was squatting in front of the console, his wrinkled hands tightly grasping the screwdriver. "Use rosin and mandrake." The spores resonated the same rhythm as the resin dripping 20 years ago, and these materials will stabilize them. Harry's cloudy eyes suddenly brightened. He had lived in the camp for 30 years, and knew better than anyone what secrets were hidden in those old things that Maggie had locked in the warehouse. "Go to the warehouse," he yelled at Irene. The second row of shelves, the bottom shelf, red-painted wooden box. Colin's hand suddenly covered the back of her hand. His palms were still stained with blood from the fight, but the temperature was incredibly hot. "I'm with you." Only then did Irene notice the wound on his shoulder and arm. Deep scratches that could see the bone were oozing dark red blood, mixed with the smell of burning from the bonfire. "You are injured like this. Don't talk nonsense." Colin smiled and grabbed the short knife at his feet with his other hand. "If the dear spirit dares to let you take risks again, I will tear it apart first." As the two men rushed into the smoke-filled camp, the roar of Jack's shotgun was coming from the east. The trip mine set by Lily exploded in the bushes, blowing away 3 survivors who were staggering towards them. Their pupils were a strange green, and around their necks hung deer antler pendants, woven with pine needles. "Hold on to me." Erin grabbed Colin's uninjured wrist and crouched with him into the abandoned shower room. The smell of mold and rust hit her face, but she didn't care about that. She dug her nails deep into Colin's palm. "Count your heartbeats with me. Don't let Lu Ling take advantage of you." Colin's pulse beat violently under her fingers, like a trapped beast banging against a cage. The wooden door of the warehouse was blown half open by the airwave, and the red lacquered wooden box fell behind the door. Irene rushed over and opened the lid of the box. The fresh scent of pine resin mixed with the smell of stale hay came out. It was exactly what she was looking for. She grabbed a handful of rosin and stuffed it into Colin's arms, and stuffed the datura petals and solder wire into her coat pocket. When she turned around, Colin suddenly blocked her, and the dagger flashed with a cold light, piercing the throat of the survivor who rushed from behind. It was a young girl with a scar on the side of her face from a cigarette burn. Irene recognized her. She had been counseled by him in the clinic this morning. The deer antler pendant around the girl's neck rolled to her feet, and the pine needles were stained with fresh blood. "Go." Colin dragged her out, blood from the wound dripping onto the mud, forming a crooked red line. The journey back to the installation area became unusually long. When they stumbled into the cabin, Kevin was pinned against the wall by 3 survivors. Harry held up the copper bell and shook it desperately, but the sound was almost inaudible over the buzzing of the device. Jack's shotgun jammed, and Lily was throwing chili powder into the trap, choking everyone and making them cough. "Use resin." Irene threw the materials in her arms to Harry, picked up the shovel in the corner and smashed it at the nearest survivor. The resin block hit the outer casing of the device, causing a white mist to rise. The survivors with green pupils suddenly stopped, as if the pause button was pressed. Colin's dagger slashed the wrist of the last attacker, and blood splattered on the petals of the datura, the red and white stinging the eyes. Harry's hands were shaking. He pressed the lump of rosin against the crack in the device and melted the solder wire over the lighter, bonding the rosin to the metal. He crushed the datura petals and scattered them into the spores. The green fluorescence gradually dimmed, but just as he was about to complete the last step, the device suddenly emitted a shrill scream. "Dear spirit." Harry's forehead was covered with sweat. "It's resisting." Irene's temple was throbbing. She recalled the rainy night 20 years ago when she was hiding behind a tree clutching the deer antler pendant. And the resin in her fingernails was also hot. She reached out her hand and pressed it against the device casing. This time it wasn't scalding hot, but bone-chillingly cold. The smell of burning solder, Colin's campfire, the bitterness of the mandrake in his own palm, and the deepest resentment that had been entangled for 20 years were twisting around the core of the device like a snake. Here, her fingertips moved along the shell and stopped in front of a very thin crack. The smell of pine resin suddenly changed here, mixed with the fishy smell of rust and rotten leaves. That was the smell of the sarcophagus 20 years ago. Fill this with datura juice. She pulled off her scarf and dipped it in the crushed petals. The power of the deer spirit seeps through here, and it fears the bitterness of datura. Harry paused, then immediately did as he was told. The moment the mandrake juice seeped into the cracks, the buzzing of the device suddenly rose and then suddenly weakened. The green spores seemed to have been drained of their strength, and fell to the ground, turning into a pool of sticky green slurry. It's stable for now. Harry slumped to the ground, and the screwdriver fell to his feet with a clang. Colin stumbled suddenly. Irene supported him, and then she found that there was still a hint of green in his pupils. That was the trace of the deer spirit personality that had not completely faded away. He gave a wan smile. It seems to be looking at us. The wind outside the cabin suddenly became strong. There was a rustling sound in the pine forest as if something was climbing up the tree trunks. Irene looked at the cracks on the device that had not completely healed, smelled the resin and mandala remaining in the air, and suddenly remembered the scratch on the sarcophagus that she had made when she was 10 years old. At this moment a very faint green light was emitting from that scratch, like an open eye. The firewood in the cabin's fireplace crackled and sent sparks flying onto the pine floor, which was still smelling burnt when Irene stepped on it. She stared at the faint green in Colin's pupils, and her Adam's apple moved. The green was like a thin snake, slowly moving along the whites of his eyes. Magnetic field. Harry suddenly spoke, pressing his wrinkled hands on the device casing. I checked the camp map. The fire 20 years ago burned through the underground magnetite vein. The sarcophagus was buried in the fault zone of the vein. The spores in the resin absorbed the geomagnetic radiation. His cloudy eyes lit up. The power of the deer spirit is not an illusion. It uses magnetic field resonance to control brain waves. Irene's fingers unconsciously stroked the silver chain around her neck. It was an old photo she always wore, with the resin of her childhood still stuck on the back. Every time before Colin's deer spirit personality erupted, she could smell a stronger smell of pine resin mixed with rust. He always complains of tinnitus when he's ill. She looked up suddenly. It's like an electric sound, right? Colin grabbed her wrist. His palm was surprisingly hot, like someone is typing Morse code in their head. Cold sweat seeped out of his forehead. Last time by the lake, I saw all the trees connected into a green net, and in the center of the net was the shadow of a deer antler. When brain waves overlap with the geomagnetic resonance frequency, external consciousness can invade. Irene's voice was as light as a feather, but it made everyone hold their breath. If we can enter his consciousness world and interfere with the resonance frequency... No, Jack's hunting knife slammed on the table. You are a psychiatrist, not an exorcist. That thing can drive people crazy. I've seen worse. Irene interrupted him, her fingertips stroking the old scar on the back of Colin's hand, which was scratched by a reef 10 years ago when he tried to save a drowning child. The night his brother committed suicide, he ran 3 kilometers in the rain to find me and said, I heard him crying in the pine forest. Her eyes were red when she looked up. At that time there was this green light in his pupils. Colin suddenly held her hand, and his fingertips rubbed the calluses on her palm from holding the pen for a long time. Come in, I believe you. Lily quickly spread the traps around the cabin, with the nets soaked in datura juice. Jack loaded the shotgun and pointed the muzzle at the swaying shadows of the trees outside the window. Kevin stood by the device ready to tighten the loose screws with a wrench at any time. Irene let Colin lie on the carpet covered with pine needles. She knelt beside him and covered his eyes with her palms. Follow my breathing and count the smell of pine resin. The smell of pine resin came over her fingertips. First, there was the sweet scent of resin, followed by a faint smell of rust. That was the blood in the sarcophagus. Further in, mixed with the damp smell of rotting leaves, was the bush behind the summer camp toilet where Maggie had tied the children up, as part of her corrective therapy, 20 years earlier. At the very bottom there was Colin's unique scent, mint-flavored toothpaste, and the cedar-flavored perfume he always wore. The door to the world of consciousness creaked open. Irene stood in a pine forest. The moonlight was cut into pieces by the treetops, and what fell on the ground was not pine needles, but a group photo of the summer camp from 20 years ago. She bent down and picked up one. The girls in the photo all had deer antlers, and their smiles were as stiff as puppets. The wind blew through the woods, and the photos fluttered, revealing the soil underneath. All of them were buried sarcophagi, and each coffin was engraved with a name. Colin's brother, the girl who committed suicide, and the children who watched at the time. You're late. The voice came from above.
Aaron looked up and saw the dark shadow of a deer antler, perched on the tallest red pine, the branch-like tips of its horns dripping with green spores.
Its face belonged to Colin, but it had an unnatural grin on it. His guilt is enough to support me for 20 years. What are you trying to steal from me? Irene reached into her pocket, where Colin's brother's old pocket watch was. She had found it in a wooden box in the attic 3 days ago, with the words "To the bravest brother" engraved on the inside of the watch cover. His guilt is because he failed to protect his brother. She held up the pocket watch, and the metal surface reflected the distorted outline of the shadow. But you took advantage of his kindness. The tip of the shadow paused. Irene took the opportunity to crush a photo at her feet. It was Colin's 17th birthday photo. He was holding a cake and his brother was smearing cream on his face behind him. He remembers his brother teaching him how to make a fire. Remembers his brother taking the beating from Maggie for him. Remembers his brother saying, "Don't tell Mom I'm scared." Her voice was like a needle, piercing into the core of the shadow. You can't steal these memories. The shadow let out a piercing scream, and the pine forest began to shake. The photo was blown into a hurricane. The sarcophagus cracked, and foul-smelling green slurry gushed out. Irene stumbled back and suddenly tripped over something. It was the 10-year-old figure of Colin, squatting on the ground and scratching the sarcophagus with a stone. "Sister." Little Colin raised his face, his eyes without green light. "Can this scratch trap bad things?" Irene knelt in front of him and took out a photo of herself when she was 10 years old. She was in summer camp at that time and witnessed bullying, but dared not say anything. There were marks she had secretly scratched on the back of the photo. Yes, she put the two photos together, making sure the scratches fit perfectly. As long as we scratched together, the wind in the conscious world suddenly became still. Cracks appeared on the tips of the black shadow's corners, like the outer shell of a device corroded by mandrake juice. Irene heard Lily's exclamation from outside. "The spores are retreating. They're awake." Colin's fingers moved in her palm. She looked down and saw that the green in his pupils was fading, revealing a familiar brown color. At this moment, the pine forest outside the wooden house suddenly roared, as if thousands of troops were running. Irene turned her head to look at the window. Under the moonlight, the branches of all the pine trees were twisted and pointed toward the cabin. On the front row of tree trunks, the shadows of huge deer antlers emerged, clearer than ever before, and the green sap dripping from the tips of the antlers gathered on the ground to form a stream flowing towards the cabin. Daring, Jack's shotgun went off, but only shattered a pane of window glass. Where the green slurry flowed, the wood sizzled and smoked, emitting a strange blue flame. Colin sat up suddenly, resting his forehead against hers. "It's going to die together." His voice was trembling. but he smiled lightly. But we still have one last card. The deer outside the cabin let out a deafening roar.
Irene smelled a new scent mixed with the resin smell. It was burning mandrake, blood with a smell of rust, and the scorched earth from 20 years ago.
She held Colin's hand and heard the cries of the survivors in the distance, and even more clearly, the sound of heartbeats. That was their common living heartbeat. The warmth of Colin's palm still remained on Irene's fingertips, and that temperature was gradually getting hotter with the roar outside the window. As she turned, Jack's shotgun blasted a second time beside her ear, this time hitting the twisted pine branches. The broken branches smashed into the green pulp stream, and in the rising blue smoke, she could clearly smell the perfume of her childhood bully, which was so sweet that it tasted bitter. "Lily, or tripwire mine to the east," she shouted at the top of her lungs, holding on to Colin as he staggered. The man's forehead was covered in sweat, but he still used his body to shield her from the green spray coming in through the broken window. "The deer spirit is pulling away from my consciousness. It's putting all its strength into one final blow." His voice was double-toned, as if another person was whispering in his throat. "But I can feel what it's afraid of." There was a sharp sound of metal friction outside the wooden house. Lily's trap was triggered. Irene saw the girl with a high ponytail kneeling on the ground, adjusting the spring lock. 3 homemade resin bombs were sizzling beside her combat boots. The resin was mixed with mandrake powder, which was the exorcism material Harry had used last night. It can temporarily block the green paste. When Lily looked up, a red mark was burned on her left cheek by the blue fire. But they are taking a detour. Kevin's telescope suddenly hit the windowsill. This mysterious visitor who always likes to wear a black windbreaker breathes rapidly. The tip of the deer shadow's horn is moving. Just now you were pointing at the flagpole. Now you are turning to the well platform. He flipped open the old notebook he carried with him, and the yellowed pages were densely covered with drawings of the movement of deer shadows. In the group photos over the past 20 years, the well platform is the only building that has not been burned. Maggie's father always said there was a cleansing power there. Harry's spell suddenly rose in volume. The old wizard squatted in front of the cast iron stove in the corner, burning half a charred deer bone. Tiny fluorescent lights floated in the smoke. "It is absorbing the vitality of the pine forest. Every antler shadow is a straw." He slammed his wrinkled hands on the ground, and the deer bones instantly exploded into powder. "But rosin is the blood of the tree. Aaron, smell it." Aaron took a deep breath. In the bitter taste of pine resin, the dryness of scorched earth, the sweetness of blood rust, and the spiciness of datura are being reassembled, just like the early morning after the fire. 20 years ago, when she squatted beside the pile of charred wood and smelled this mixed smell, and at the very bottom, there was a faint cold fragrance, like moss covered with snow. It was the smell of the cedar brooch that Colin's brother often wore before he committed suicide. "It's the anchor point." She suddenly grabbed Colin's wrist, and the touch was surprisingly hot. The power of the deer spirit does not come out of thin air. It needs to be connected to the evidence of 20 years ago. Well platforms, flagpoles, incinerators. These places must have been buried with something. Colin's pupils suddenly contracted, and a hint of green flashed in the brown, but he suppressed it fiercely. "My brother," he said before he died, that there was an eye in the well. The first gap in the defense line appeared at this time. The resin bomb to the east was smashed by the deer shadow. The green pulp rushed onto the porch of the wooden house, like a living thing, and Lily's spring lock made a desperate snapping sound. Jack's shotgun jammed, and he swore as he changed the magazine, the burns on his arms oozing weird green bubbles. Harry's smoke began to thin, and the fluorescent dots went out one by one.
It's speeding up.
Kevin's voice trembled. The tip of the horn is now pointing in 3 places at the same time. Irene held Colin's hand tightly and pressed her other hand on her chest. The heartbeat there had never been so clear, mixed with the heartbeats of everyone inside and outside the cabin, vibrating the air like a drum. She looked at Colin's face, twisted in pain, and suddenly remembered what he said 3 days ago. Multiple personality is not a disease. It is my way of living for my brother. We need to sever the connection. She raised her voice, letting each word cut through the thunder. The dear spirit relies on those old locations to maintain its strength. If we destroy the anchor point, it will become a rootless spirit. Jack wiped the sweat off his face, and the pain from the burns made him grit his teeth. How did you destroy it? The area around the wellhead is full of green slurry, and it can burn through the soles of your shoes if you step on it for half a minute. Lily pulled off the corner of her clothes to wrap around the wound. Her eyes brightened amazingly. I can make a heat insulation pad, resin mixed with clay, wrapped around boots. Harry threw the last handful of mandrake into the furnace, and the smoke began to rise again. I will use a spell to delay it for 3 minutes, which is enough time for you to run to the well. Kevin suddenly closed his notebook, revealing a hunting knife under his black windbreaker. I know how to open the lock on the wellhead. Maggie's father used a cross lock, and the key is... He paused, with Colin's fingers suddenly clasped Irene's wrist tightly, and the green completely disappeared from his eyes, leaving only a reddish brown. I'll go with you. I know the weakness of the deer spirit better than anyone else. The deer outside the wooden house let out a deafening roar, and the shadow of its antlers cast a huge net on the ground, which was about to cover it. Irene looked at the blood-stained clothes, burned skin, and tightly clenched weapons of her companions, and smelled the increasingly distinct hot breath of the living in the resin. That was a power more powerful than any spell. We'll leave in 10 minutes. Her voice was so calm that even she was surprised. Lily will make the potholders, Jack will check the ammunition, Harry will prepare the spell, and Kevin will get the keys. Colin. She turned to the man beside her and kissed his palm gently. You are responsible for distracting the deer spirit. The roar of the deer was getting closer, and the green stream had already reached the steps of the wooden house. But this time, Erin didn't smell fear. What she smelled was the crackling of burning resin, the salty smell of scabs on wounds, and the fresh smell of the survivors standing together for the first time in 20 years. A long deer cry was heard from the direction of the well. The resin crackled in the tin lamp, and Irene's fingers traced the old scar on Colin's palm. It was the cut he got from broken glass when he tried to save her last winter. At this moment, the hands were holding her wrists, and the body temperature seeped in through the coarse cloth cuffs, like an endless wildfire. The insulation pad is made of asbestos mixed with pine glue. It can last for 3 minutes. Lily stuffed the grey cloth folded into a square into the side pocket of Irene's backpack. The pine resin on the ends of her hair glowed amber in the firelight. I have set a trip mine on the southeast side of the trap, but the deer spirit may take a detour. That's enough. Jack patted the double-barreled shotgun on his waist. Half a deer antler was embedded in the shiny wood grain of the buttstock. I can feel every ridge in this forest with my eyes closed. No matter how powerful that ghost thing is, it can never turn into an old pine tree that hasn't grown for 20 years. He winked at Irene. When I was a forest ranger for old Maggie's father, I used an axe to split the tunnel under the well platform. Harry's spellbook was open on the table, with dried deer tongue grass between the parchment pages. The old man suddenly raised his head, and the shadow cast by his hooked nose covered half of his face. The spores in the green pulp will confuse your 5 senses, but the sound of your heartbeat, he tapped his chest with his knuckles, is the cleanest compass. Kevin remained silent, the keyring jingling in his palm. It was a bunch of copper keys, and the cross-shaped key teeth at the top were still dark red, like coagulated blood. Irene recalled how he had pushed open the door of the cabin an hour ago, rain dripping down his mountaineering suit, and he was holding tightly in his arms a 1999 summer camp registration book, the edges of the pages charred black, the traces of the pine forest fire that had devoured half of the camp that year. 10 minutes. Irene took a deep breath. The smell of pine resin was mixed with the spicy aroma of Jack's tobacco, the faint smell of cedar soap on Colin's body, and the sweetness of pine resin on the ends of Lily's hair. These fresh, body-warm scents were more reassuring than any spell. Colin suddenly held her face in his hands. His thumb rubbed the dark shadows under her eyes, which were the marks left by not closing her eyes for 3 consecutive days. If Luling, his Adam's apple rolled, and the dark green flashed very lightly in the depths of his pupils, and was quickly submerged by brown. If I can't control myself, you can shoot me in the heart. Aaron held down his gun hand. The temperature of his palm was surprisingly hot, like a piece of red-hot iron. That day will never come. She stood on tiptoe and kissed the corner of his lips, tasting the taste of rust. He had bitten his lip, because 20 years ago, someone survived the darkest night for us. The sound of a deer calling out could be heard outside the wooden house, long and sad. When the trio set out, the moon was half-eaten by dark clouds. The green sap in the pine forest glowed with a faint light, like countless pairs of drooping eyes. Jack walked in front, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. The pine needles crushed on the soles of his boots, making a crackling sound. Colin was in the middle, his left hand always pressed on the hilt of the dagger on his right waist. It was a coming-of-age gift from his brother before he committed suicide. The hilt was wrapped with a faded blue ribbon. Irene was the last one, touching the camera in her backpack every 3 steps. There was a piece of resin stuck to the inside of the lens cap, which was the key she used to capture the smell when she touched the old photos. Stop. Jack suddenly raised his hand. He squatted down and broke the dead branches between his fingers. Tripwire, a green vine as thin as a hair, was wrapped between 2 spruce trees. The thorns on the vine oozed mucus, shining like fangs in the moonlight. The deer spirit has learned it well, using spore vines instead of wire. He pulled out his saber and cut the vines. The mucus splashed on the blade and made a hissing sound. Old Maggie's father loved to use this trick back then, calling it nature's punishment. Colin's breathing suddenly became rapid. Aaron smelled cedar on him. Overlaid with rust, his physiological response to anxiety. She reached out and hooked her finger around his little finger, squeezing it gently like she used to do during psychotherapy. His fingers immediately clenched back, and the sweat from his palm soaked the back of her hand. Illusion. Irene suddenly stopped. In the woods ahead, the 16-year-old self was standing by the well, with a blue ribbon tied in her ponytail. That was her appearance forever in 1990. That was the last day of summer camp that year. I was here. Her throat tightened, and the smell of scorched earth suddenly emerged from the smell of pine resin, the smell of the fire in her memory. Colin's dagger was unsheathed with a swish. The blue ribbon floated in the illusion, and Aaron's face began to twist, with the shape of antlers protruding from the skin. Don't look at her eyes. Aaron grabbed his wrist. This is the embodiment of traumatic memory, and the spores magnify our guilt. She took out a block of pine resin from her backpack, put it to her nose and took a deep breath. The smell of scorched earth faded, replaced by the spicy scent of Jack's tobacco and the warmth of Colin's palm. The real wellhead is in the northwest. We've circled 20 degrees. Jack whistled a low whistle. He raised his shotgun and pointed it at the illusion's chest, but the bullet went through Aaron's body and shattered the old pine tree behind her. A black object rolled out of the tree hole. It was a gnawed deer skeleton with half a rusty cross key stuck in the skull. It's a road sign. Kevin's voice suddenly sounded in Irene's ears. She then realized that she had taken out the intercom without knowing when. The background sound on the other end was the metal clanging sound of Lily's traps. The 1999 line register said that the entrance to the well platform tunnel was hidden behind 3 pine trees with overlapping growth rings. That deer skeleton, the electric current crackled, was the hunting dog raised by the forest ranger who was responsible for guarding the tunnel back then. Colin suddenly grabbed Irene's arm. His pupils turned completely green. His fangs pierced his lower lip, and blood dripped onto the blue ribbon. It's coming. The ground began to shake. Green slurry surged in from all directions, gathered into streams, and weaved into a web at the feet of the three people. The shadow of the deer in the distance grew longer and longer, and the green light at the tip of the antlers pierced through the clouds. The moonlight leaked through, illuminating the huge trap on the open space ahead. It was a deep pit with a diameter of 5 meters. The bottom of the pit was filled with barbed antlers, and each antler was entangled with a wriggling spore vine. To the left, Jack rushed over and pushed Irene away. A spore vine scraped across the back of her neck, leaving a charred mark on the tree trunk. Colin's dagger cut through another vine, and green juice splashed on the back of his hand, immediately causing red and swollen blisters. He seemed to feel no pain and pushed Irene behind Jack. Take her away. But it was too late. Footsteps were heard from all directions. It's the survivors. Irene recognized Lucy, the girl who always picked up her textbooks that were thrown into the mud. At this moment her pupils were glowing green and she was holding a piece of bloody broken glass in her hand. There was also Tommy, the fat boy who was always ridden like a horse by Bully. Now his arms were thicker, with the outline of deer antlers protruding under his muscles, and he was holding an axe for chopping wood in his hand. In the front was Sarah, a victim of the summer camp. On her wrist was still tied the red scarf that led to her suicide, and on her neck, which should have been soft, there was half a bloody deer antler. Jack's shotgun was shaking. Didn't they all move away? Maggie's orthotics. Erin's voice was shaking. She reached out for her camera, and the resin on the inside of the lens cap suddenly gave off a rancid stench, the smell of long-term captivity. She didn't let them leave. She locked them in the tunnel, using spores to control them. Sarah held up her red scarf. All the survivors screamed at the same time. Broken glass, chopping axes and rusty table knives rained down on them. Colin stood in front of Irene. There was a struggle in his dark green eyes, and the dagger drew a silver arc in the moonlight, chopping off 2 table knives. "Run," he roared, with 2 tones mixed in his voice. One was his own, and the other was as low as an animal. "Run into the trap." Irene's heart was beating so hard it was about to explode. She smelled a strong smell of rust, suddenly emerging from the resin. It was the blood from Colin's wound, the gunpowder in Jack's gun barrel, the stench on the survivors' bodies, and even more, the smell of hope. She grasped Jack's arm and pointed to the clump of deer tongue grass at the edge of the trap, exactly the same one that was tucked into Harry's spell book. "Get down," she yelled. 3 people rushed towards the trap at the same time. The barbs of deer antlers whizzed overhead. Sarah's red scarf brushed against Irene's hair and landed on the edge of the trap. On the scarf there was a line of words written in blood. "There is a secret passage under the stone bricks of the well platform." Irene dug her nails deep into her palms, and the rotten smell of resin surged in her nostrils. She looked at the clump of deer tongue grass at the edge of the trap, with dew still condensing on its leaves, and suddenly remembered the insert she had found in Harry's spellbook 3 days ago. The yellowed page had Latin words that said, "Resin spores are afraid of wormwood and deer tongues. Their smell is turbid, and their wisdom is blind." "Jack," she said, grabbing the hunter's buckskin belt, "go to the east pine bush and pick 3 handfuls of wormwood. Colin, cut down the biggest deer tongue grass, and keep the roots." Colin's dagger was still dripping with blood, and the animality in his dark green pupils was receding like the tide. He cut off the hem of his shirt with his backhand and wrapped the deer tongue grass tightly. The blood from the wound splashed on the leaves, and a few wisps of light white smoke rose. "Spores are afraid of blood," he panted, and the double tone in his voice finally dissipated. "Erin, I feel they are avoiding my blood." Erin's heart suddenly skipped a beat. The rainy night 20 years ago suddenly flashed back to me. The bullied girl huddled in the corner of the tent. The deer antler necklace around her neck hit the stone. The blood seeping out fell into the mud, and the laughter around her suddenly blurred for a moment. It turned out that it was not an illusion. It was blood. It is the victim's blood that can temporarily suppress the assailant's spores. Jack's military boots broke the dead branches and he quickly ran back, carrying a pile of wormwood half a man's height. Irene took out the windproof lighter she carried with her, and piled up some grass at the edge of the trap. The moment the sparks flew, smoke mixed with the scent of burnt pine needles, and the bitter smell of mugwort rose up. The controlled survivors suddenly covered their mouths and noses. Sarah's red scarf fell from the edge of the trap and brushed against the back of Irene's hand. She smelled fresh blood. It was not the rotten smell of a cage, but the splash of blood from the struggle of a living person. "They're still alive." She grabbed Colin's wrist. The spores just controlled their senses, not their bodies. Colin's fingers tightened in her palm, and blood with his body temperature stained her wrist. Lily screamed in the smoke. "The trap is triggered. The barbed net has fallen." Irene dragged the two of them into the smoke, and behind them came the sound of metal colliding and muffled sobs. When they emerged from the fog, the blue stone slabs of the well platform were within reach. Jack pulled out the short axe from his waist and pried up the middle brick in 2 or 3 moves. A damp, moldy smell, mixed with the smell of rust, came out. Below was a black hole that was only wide enough for one person to pass through. Rusty iron rings were embedded in the stone wall, like a string of rotten teeth. Colin jumped down first, and when he turned around to catch Irene, her fingertips touched the back of his neck. There was a raised scar there, the shape of which coincided with the outline of a deer antler. "It was my brother's necklace that burned me." Colin's voice was muffled in the tunnel. "Before he killed himself, he stuffed the necklace into my hand and said, 'Watch them for me.' Later, I kept dreaming that a deer was gnawing at my brain. It turned out it wasn't a dream." The tunnel became wider and wider, and suddenly a faint green light appeared in front. The light pulsed like a living thing, casting distorted shadows on the rock wall, the shadows of deer antlers.
Irene's temples were throbbing, and the smell of pine resin suddenly became sweet, like rotten honey.
She took out her camera. The resin on the inside of the lens cap was melting. The seeping liquid glowed dark green in the moonlight and vibrated in unison with the light in front. The energy source. Colin's voice was tight. "I can feel it. It's sucking my emotions away. Anger, guilt, hatred were all swallowed up by it and turned into the power that controlled them." Irene remembered that when she used high-frequency whistles to interfere with the deer spirit personality, Colin's pupils would briefly return to brown. She took out the sound wave generator she carried with her and pressed the switch. Amid the sharp beeping sound, the dark green light flickered twice, but soon stabilized again, and was even brighter than before. "It's useless." Colin's Adam's apple rolled. "It has evolved. Or rather, it was originally formed by our evil thoughts." Suddenly, the sound of stones rubbing against each other came from deep in the tunnel. Kevin's voice exploded from the intercom. "Harry said the jammer has been upgraded. Adjust the sound wave frequency to 1117 Hz to synchronize with the resonant frequency of the energy source." Irene's fingers flew on the generator, and the moment the number jumped to 117, the green light suddenly trembled violently, and the shadow of the antler on the rock wall twisted into countless fragments. Now, Colin rushed towards the energy source, which was a crystal embedded in the rock wall. The surface was covered with fine cracks, and green mist flowed in each crack. The moment his palm pressed down, the crystal made a shrill buzzing sound, and the green mist in the cracks suddenly flowed back and penetrated into his cuffs. Irene saw his pupils turn green again, but this time they were not as turbid as animals. "Irene," his voice was strangely clear, like the boy who blocked rocks for her in the rainstorm 20 years ago. "This is my brother's memory. He said that forgiveness is more powerful than hatred." The vibration of the crystal suddenly intensified. and rocks fell from the top of the tunnel. Irene's camera fell to the ground with a bang. The lens cover popped off, and melted resin dripped onto the crystal. The stench of decay, blood, scorched earth. All the smells sealed by the resin suddenly exploded. The green mist began to surge wildly, and the cracks on the surface of the crystal spread like a spider web. "It's going to break." Jack grabbed Irene's arm and backed away. At this moment, the entire tunnel suddenly shook violently. Irene's forehead hit the rock wall, and her vision went black. When she opened her eyes again, the crystal had cracked into a finger-wide gap, and a faint green light gushed out from the gap, condensing into the outline of a huge deer antler in midair. The shadow of the antlers covered Colin's face. Blood was flowing from the corners of his mouth, but he was smiling. "It's afraid," he said, "because we're finally daring to look at our sins." The vibration became more and more violent, and the iron rings on the rock wall fell off one after another. Irene grasped Colin's hand, feeling the warmth draining from his palm. In the dim green light, she saw countless faces, the participants of this summer camp 20 years ago, all of whom were now crying in the light. Sarah's red scarf floated from the depths of the tunnel and gently covered the cracks in the crystal. Blood words appeared in the light. "The real secret passage is in everyone's heart." Her in. Jack's roar was torn apart by the vibration. The crystal suddenly emitted a deafening roar, and green mist rushed to the top of the cave like a living thing. Irene looked up and saw the tip of the antler's shadow pointed at Colin's heart. That was the final fatal blow of the deer spirit. The tunnel shook with a roar, and Colin's blood dripped onto the crystal, blooming into a dark red flower. Irene smelled an unprecedented fragrance coming from the pine resin, like a pine forest washed by heavy rain, with new moisture, and the shadow of the deer antlers is slowly sinking. The rock walls of the tunnel groaned as if they were about to die, and Irene's nails almost dug into Colin's palm. She could feel his pulse, like a candle in the wind, getting weaker and weaker. The tip of the antler's shadow had already touched the position 2 fingers below his collarbone, which was the direction of his heart. Tiny ice crystals floated in the dim green light, and each of them reflected that rainy night. 20 years ago, Sarah curled up in the corner of the tent, her school uniform torn to pieces, her cries soaked by the heavy rain. "Erin." Jack's roar mixed with the dull sound of falling gravel hit his eardrums. She looked up and saw the hunter climbing towards her by clinging to the sloping rock wall, his hunting knife glowing coldly in the green light. Lily's trap rope was hanging on the collapsed beam, like a torn spider web, and Kevin was helping the wizard Harry retreat deeper into the tunnel. The bronze bell in the old man's arms jingled, making a discordant vibrato in the vibration. "Risen," Irene suddenly shouted. Colin's blood dripped onto the back of her hand, hot and scalding. She remembered the fragrance of the pine forest washed by the heavy rain just now. The smell of pine resin evaporated by high temperature, and the fragrance that exploded when children roasted pine cones at the bonfire in the summer camp 20 years ago. At that time, Sarah always liked to pick the fullest pine cones, saying she would take them home and plant them in her backyard. Pine branches. She dragged Colin to the nearest crack in the rock wall, where a half-burned tree trunk was inserted diagonally, and pine resin condensed into amber lumps in the crack. The energy source of the deer spirit is afraid of the smell of pine resin. She pulled open her collar, revealing the silver chain hanging around her neck, which was strung with pine resin scraped from old photos and was now hot. Colin suddenly choked and coughed. Blood splattered on the resin, and the amber color instantly turned dark red. "It is eating guilt." The shadow of the antlers was reflected in his pupils, but his voice was like returning to the night when he was 12 years old, hiding in the closet and heard his brother cutting his wrists. Sarah's pain, our silence, are all its nutrient. Jack had already cut off 2 hanging chains and threw a bundle of pine branches at Irene's feet. The pine needles were still covered with fresh pine resin, which shone glossily in the green light. Lily had climbed to the top of the cave at some point and dropped down a few hemp ropes soaked in pine resin. Use this to start a fire. Her voice was wrapped in the unique echo of the tunnel. I added gunpowder powder to the rope core so it can burn longer. Irene's hands were shaking as she took out the lighter. Memories from 20 years ago suddenly came flooding back. She was a bystander hiding behind a tree and watching 5 boys blocking Sarah's tent. She was an accomplice saying I didn't hear any noise when the teacher asked. She was a survivor, seeing a dark figure with deer antlers standing behind Sarah on the day the group photo was developed. The smell of pine resin exploded the moment the flames rose, like a sledgehammer hitting her temple. It was the smell of scorched earth mixed with blood, the pine resin that was soaked in Sarah's last suicide note. In the letter she said that she wanted to bury all the secrets in the pine forest. The dark green light suddenly twisted, and the tip of the antler's shadow shook like a snake that had been splashed with cold water. Colin suddenly grabbed Irene's wrist, his nails almost digging into her bones. It's looking for the most painful memory. His other hand pressed on his chest, where the shirt was soaked with blood. Use your scent to cover those rotten guilt. Amid the crackling sound of burning pine branches, Irene could hear her own pounding heart. She closed her eyes and let the smell of pine resin fill her nostrils. It was the pine forest in the morning mist, with dewdrops hanging on the pine needles. It was the opening ceremony of the summer camp, with Sarah holding pine branches as torches. It was last winter, when she met a bullied girl in the clinic, and the pine resin on the girl was exactly the same as it was now. The shadow of the antlers began to shrink, like a monster whose bones and muscles had been pulled out. Jack took the opportunity to pounce, and chopped the crystal of the energy source with his hunting knife, sending out a string of sparks. Now, he yelled. Lily, set the trap. But the change came faster than the burning of resin. The crystal suddenly burst out with a dazzling green light, and the electric current rushed up along Jack's hunting knife. The hunter was thrown against the rock wall, and the hunting knife fell at Irene's feet with a clang. Colin was shaking from coughing. His fingers dug into Irene's wrist, leaving purple marks on her skin. It wants to die together, using my body as a container. No. Irene knelt on the ground and protected Colin with her body. Sharp spikes of light began to condense around the energy source. Each one was half a person's height, with a cold blue light at the tip. She saw Lily frantically untying the knots at the top of the cave. Kevin was pressing Harry's bronze bell against the crystal, and the old man's lips were moving, chanting an incomprehensible spell. Sarah's red scarf was wrapped around Colin's wrist at some point, and the bloody words flickered in the green light. The real secret passage is in everyone's heart. Look at me. Irene held Colin's face, his eyelashes stained with blood. Do you remember what you said? We finally dare to look at our sins. She pressed the rosin crumbs to his lips. Now look with me. The sound of the first ray of light cutting through the air was like a baby crying. Irene's temples were throbbing, and the smell of pine resin suddenly became unusually clear. Not scorched earth, not blood, but the smell of sprouting Sara pine seeds, of a pine forest that had been soaked by heavy rain and then exposed to the sun for 3 days, and of the moment after 20 years when they finally dared to admit that they were the murderers. The antler shadow suddenly let out a sharp scream. Irene saw that the green light in Colin's pupils was receding, revealing the original brown color underneath. His fingers gently stroked the tear marks on her face and smiled. So, the smell of pine resin is forgiveness. The beam of light was only half a meter away from their heads. Lily's rope net suddenly fell from the top of the cave, wrapped in burning pine branches and covering the energy source. Kevin's bronze bell made a clear and long sound, causing spiderweb-like cracks to appear on the surface of the crystal. Harry pressed his hand on the crack and shouted something in a low voice. Colin in Irene's arms was pointing with his bloody finger at the core of the energy source. There was a dark red dot beating there, like a heart. That's my blood, Colin said, his voice barely more than a sigh. The last ray of light brushed against the ends of Irene's hair and pierced into the ground. The vibration of the tunnel suddenly stopped, as if even time had held its breath at this moment. Irene looked at the dark red in the energy source, and then at Colin's bloody lips. The aroma of pine resin was still swirling in the air, mixed with the sweet smell of blood, like some kind of ancient oath. She grabbed the hunting knife at her feet, the handle still retaining the warmth of Jack's palm. "Let's go home," she said. After the dust in the tunnel settled, Irene helped Colin out of the cave just as the morning mist was covering the fir forest in the camp. The dew on the pine needles hit her shoulders, bringing with it a sweet scent of grass. This was the first time in 20 years that she had smelled pine scent without the smell of blood and rust in this place. "They're awake." Jack's voice came from the center of the camp. Irene looked up and saw that the survivors who were controlled by the deer spirit to fight each other last night were sitting up, rubbing their temples. Some of them were staring at their bloody nails and trembling, and some were hugging their companions and crying. The door to Maggie's cabin was half open, and her grey hair flashed behind the door frame and then quickly retreated. Colin's fingers moved gently in her palm. "Go to the barn." His voice was still a little trembling, but it was clearer than ever before. "The trial needs a table, a place where everyone can see each other." Irene nodded. She remembered that when she was 12, it was in this barn that Maggie locked them up for 3 days in the name of corrective therapy. The scratches from those years are still visible on the wooden walls of the barn, like countless hands reaching toward the sky. At 3 p.m., when Irene pushed open Robert's tent with a pile of old files, the retired judge was studying a yellowed summer camp registration form with a magnifying glass. List of participants in 1999. He looked up, his eyes behind the lenses like a scalpel. Maggie's father was the camp director, and the parents of these children include 3 congressmen and 2 oil company executives. That's why she dared to use correction as a fig leaf. Irene slapped the diary she found in the tunnel on the table. There was still rosin on the cover. That was Maggie's handwriting, recording how to use hallucinogenic spores mixed with rosin to create group hallucinations. The trial is not to send someone to prison, but to make them admit that they have used violence and said stabbing. Robert's finger traced the note "Obedience is purification" in the diary, and suddenly laughed. "I have presided over 300 trials. The most difficult thing is never the law, but the human heart." He took off his glasses. "Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, the barn. I want to see at least 10 survivors who are willing to talk." At the same time, the smell of burnt coffee wafted through the camp restaurant. Maggie added a spoonful of sugar to Emily's mug, and the silver bracelet on her wrist made a crisp sound. "You were only 13 years old at that time. If you say you were instigated, the judge will believe it. But if you stand up now..." When she leaned over, half of a deer antler pendant appeared from her collar, which was almost identical to Lucas's. "Your mother's nursing home should pay the nursing fee this month." Emily's fingers crumpled the tablecloth. She remembered yesterday in the tunnel. Irene held her hand and said, "Smell, the resin is wiping your tears." But at this moment Maggie's words were like a thin needle, piercing her softest spot. Her mother's Alzheimer's disease was getting worse and worse, and she could not afford anything other than that private nursing home. "Emily?" Irene's voice came from the door. Maggie's hands suddenly retracted, and the silver bracelet cracked against the wall of the cup. Irene's eyes swept across the two of them, and landed on Emily's white knuckles. She sniffed softly again. In addition to the aroma of coffee, there was also a faint smell of rust in the air. It was Maggie who had mixed crushed deer antler powder into the sugar jar while Emily wasn't paying attention. "Lily installed a tripwire alarm outside your tent." Irene walked over to Emily and placed her warm palm on the back of her hand. "Jack said he would patrol the area tonight." She turned to Maggie with a faint smile on her lips. "Captain, why don't you go check the kitchen? I think I smell burnt pine resin. A bit like the smell of the confinement room 20 years ago." Maggie's face turned pale instantly, as she grabbed her coat and rushed out the door. Irene clearly heard her curse meddling bitch under her breath. As night fell, George's campfire crackled in the middle of the camp. Erin stood by the fire, watching the 20 survivors sitting in a circle. Some people clutched the summer camp badges of that year, while others stared at their own shadows and trembled. Colin stood behind her, his hands loosely protecting her lower back. This was a little gesture he had learned after the fusion of his multiple personalities, as if to confirm his real existence. Maggie said the trial was a farce, and that we should forget the past. A man in a plaid shirt suddenly spoke up. He was a camper back then, and is now a middle school teacher. But I dreamed last night that I pushed little Lucy into the resin pool. Her white skirt, his voice choked, was all stuck to the resin, like she was skinned. That wasn't a dream. Emily stood out from the crowd. Around her neck hung a lavender sachet, given by Erin to fight against hallucinogenic spores. I have the tape. She held up her phone, the screen flickering with blurry images. I went back to camp last year and found the surveillance footage in Maggie's old office. There were gasps from the crowd. Irene saw the curtain of Maggie's tent move and then stop. She knew he was waiting for someone to back down, for panic to spread like wildfire. Lucy's brother Lucas, Colin said suddenly, his voice steady than ever. When he came to us wearing the antler necklace, the spores had been in your bodies for 20 years. What Maggie sealed with resin was not a secret, but your sin. He lifted his sleeves, revealing a crescent-shaped scar on his arm. Before my brother committed suicide, he also said he smelled resin. He said it was a resin candle that my mother made, but my mother wouldn't touch it. The bonfire crackled and sparks shot into the night sky. Irene looked at the tears gradually emerging in the crowd and suddenly realized the smell of resin was never a curse. It was the anchor that Lucy left in their memory, and the oath she carved with her life that must not be forgotten. Tomorrow night, at 8 o'clock, in the barn. She raised her voice, letting every word fall into the morning mist. Those who are afraid can choose not to come, but the pine resin will remember it for you. Maggie crushed the third pen in the tent. The ink dripped onto the map through his fingers, staining the word barn into a dark red blood clot. She took out her cell phone and dialed the number she had saved for 20 years. Those parents back then could still make a farce disappear completely. But she didn't notice that the trap lily had newly set on the pine tree outside the tent was glowing coldly in the moonlight. In the barn 50 meters away, Robert was adjusting the microphone. Colin was waxing the wooden table, and Emily copied the videotapes into 3 different USB flash drives. Irene stood at the barn door, looking at the moon in the sky. It was like a silver coin sealed with resin, exactly the same as it was that night 20 years ago. The wind brought a faint fragrance which was resin, blood, forgiveness, and the horn of judgment. She touched the hunting knife in her pocket. The handle was still warm from Jack. Tomorrow night at 8 o'clock the barn door will open, and some secret should be revealed. The barn door creaked at 8 o'clock. Irene stood on the makeshift trial stand, the musty smell of pine resin mixed with old wood entering her nostrils. It was a smell she was all too familiar with. The blood and fire of 20 years ago were now flowing in through the broken window of the barn, with the moonlight flooding every tense face. July 23th, 1999. Her voice was like a guitar string soaked in resin, clear yet resilient. On a rainy night, in the storage room on the west side of the camp, there were gasps from the audience, and the fingers of several survivors dug into the cracks of the wooden chairs. Irene's eyes swept over Maggie, the woman standing in the shadows, pinching her palms with her nails. The deputy battalion commander at the time, Maggie White's father, locked up the 3 girls with corrective therapy. He said, "Wild girls need to be disciplined." And Maggie, she paused, was 16 years old at the time, and was his best helper. Maggie suddenly laughed, and her laughter sounded like broken glass. "Dr. Hawke, you should get your post-traumatic stress checked. My father was a respected camp manager, and his orthotic manual is in the tin box in your tent." Erin interrupted, pulling out an evidence bag from her pocket. Inside was a half-page of yellowed paper. There's a note you made when you were 16, written in blue ink. Tie your wrists tight. Crying will attract bears. She turned to the audience. And that night a girl broke free from the ropes. And when she ran to the edge of the cliff, Maggie chased her. She jumped herself. Maggie's voice rose, and the pine needle stuck in her hair fell off. She was too fragile. What does it have to do with us? Because you added datura to her water. Emily stood up suddenly, her voice trembling, but her eyes brightening. I was in charge of preparing the medicine and saw you pour the crushed petals into her kettle. You said, "Keep her quiet or Dad will be mad." The barn was buzzing with discussion. Maggie's face turned red, and she grabbed the chair next to her and threw it at Emily. But Jack rushed over first, holding her wrist with a clamp-like hand. "Ma'am," his voice was like sandpaper scraping against rock. "This is a judgment seat, not your private prison." Lily pushed out the projector from the backstage, and the old videotape began to rotate. The picture shows a storage room in 1990. Sharks are tied to wooden frame. One of them, wearing a pink raincoat, struggles desperately. The camera suddenly shakes and a hand wearing a pearl bracelet breaks into the picture and sprinkles a handful of powder into the kettle. That is the pearl bracelet that Maggie is still wearing, shining coldly in the camera. "This is the surveillance backup from that year," Colin said as he stood next to the projector. His dear spirit personality seemed to be asleep, and his voice was gentle but powerful. When Maggie renovated the camp last month, she turned the old surveillance room into a sauna, but she didn't notice that this tape was still stuck in the crack of the wall. Maggie suddenly rushed at Irene, almost scratching her face with her nails. "You are crazy.
You just want to ruin this place.
Those parents back then, they won't come." Lily's voice came from the barn door. She shook her phone, and a series of missed call records appeared on the screen. "I set up signal jammers around your tent. You called the person who can make the fast disappear. You probably think you are talking to voicemail now." There was sporadic applause from the audience. George held up a homemade truth sign, his eyes as red as two cherries. But Maggie suddenly turned to the crowd and cried, "Do you really believe her? What happened back then was just an accident. She is a psychiatrist. She can hypnotize you and induce your memories." Several survivors wavered, and the voices of whispering rang out again. Just then, the side door of the barn was pushed open. The moonlight came in obliquely, illuminating a man in a camel windbreaker. His left hand was in his pocket, and he held a leather briefcase in his right hand. The brim of his hat was pulled down low, revealing only his high nose bridge. Maggie's pupils suddenly contracted, and she staggered back 2 steps, knocking over the wooden bench behind her. "Mrs. Maggie," the man's voice was like metal dipped in ice, "I think you should remember this." He took out a yellow document with the seal of Colorado Juvenile Administration on the cover. "August 1999, your father's death report." It said that he accidentally took an overdose of datura while cleaning up illegal drugs in the camp. He opened the document, revealing a handwritten note on the inside page. "But you may not know that a trainee police officer took a secret note back then. He saw that it was you who put the bottle of medicine into your father's mouth." Maggie's lips began to tremble and she tried to grab the document, but was stopped by Jack. The man handed the document to Irene and turned to leave. As he passed Maggie, he lowered his voice. "The last page of your father's correctional therapy manual says, the most effective punishment is to let the perpetrator watch his sin sprout with his own eyes. Now it's sprouting." Irene flipped open the file and found an old photo on the first page. A group photo of a summer camp in 1999, with a dark figure wearing deer antlers in the background.
On the back of the photo, written in blue ink, was a line of small words, "To Maggie, my good daughter. Secrets are always harder to remove than resin."
Maggie suddenly screamed, grabbed the candlestick on the table and threw it at the documents. But Colin caught it with his bare hands. The candle wax splashed on the back of her hand, but she seemed not to feel the pain. She just stared at the man's back, until he disappeared in the pine woods, and the moonlight once again flooded the barn, illuminating 2 lines of sparkling tears on her face. Irene looked up out the window, and amid the sound of pine waves, she smelled that faint fragrance again. This time, in addition to resin and blood, there was also a faint scent of new pine needles. The briefcase of the mysterious man was now lying quietly on the judge's bench, with the clasp slightly open, revealing half a sheet of yellowed letter paper. The handwriting on it was exactly the same as Maggie's notes when she was 16. The candlelight in the barn was flickering in the draft, and Irene's fingertips could still feel the touch of the document cover. It was an old craft paper with a sticky resin, exactly the same as the cover of the corrective therapy guide locked in the drawer in Maggie's office. When she looked up, the man who handed over the documents was walking towards the door with his back to the crowd. The hem of his black windbreaker swept across the dusty wooden floor, casting a slender shadow in the moonlight. "Wait," Lily said suddenly, her trap pliers landing on the table with a clack. "Who are you?" The man paused and turned his head. Only then did Irene see his features clearly, the high nose bridge and the light brown mole under his left eye. She had seen this face 3 times in the old summer camp lists that Colin sorted out. "Kevin Mitchell," he said in a steady voice. "I was the photographer for the 1999 summer camp. I was 13 years old at the time." Maggie dug her nails into her palms, her knuckles turning white. Irene remembered that when she was looking through the camp archives 3 days ago, Maggie specifically said there was no photographer back then. But at this moment, Kevin pulled out a worn Polaroid album from the inner pocket of his windbreaker with a 99 Jacquet sticker crookedly stuck on the cover. Turning to the 3rd page, in the yellowed photo, a little boy in overalls is holding an old-fashioned camera, with the lens facing Maggie, who is making a fire. Maggie was only 16 years old at that time, and her ponytail was tied with the same blue ribbon as now. Miss Maggie may have forgotten. Kevin's thumb slid across the edge of the photo, but your father remembered. He pointed to the document in Irene's hand. That page of notes was written by old Mr. White himself. He asked me to bring you the truth about corrective therapy, using the confession letter you wrote when you were 16 as a seal. There was a gasp in the barn. Only then did Irene notice the briefcase Kevin left on the bench. The edge of the letter paper exposed by the open buckle did have Maggie's unique cursive handwriting. She had seen this habit of writing E in a small circle on the notes in Maggie's office. Maggie suddenly pounced on the briefcase, but was stopped by Hunter Jack. She staggered and knocked over the wooden stool George brought. The blue ribbon in her hair was half loose, revealing a light pink scar behind her ear. "Enough." Judge Robert slammed the gavel, his voice full of dignity. "We are here to judge Lu Ling's crimes, not to listen to these old accounts. No, this is the crime itself." Kevin raised his voice, and his voice suddenly took on the sharpness of a teenager. "On the night of July 15th, 1999, when you surrounded Anna Jones in the pine forest, I was hiding behind a tree." He ripped open the collar of his shirt, revealing a crescent-shaped scar below his collarbone. "Maggie used her father's corrective therapy to help me get rid of my cowardice, and asked you to hold me down and watch you apply pine resin on Anna. Watch her screaming and running towards the bonfire." Irene's temple was throbbing. She touched the silver chain around her neck, which was her olfactory compensator, and was now slightly hot. The sweet and fishy smell of rosin, mixed with the smell of burning, suddenly rushed into my nose, overlapping with the memory of the smell of bullying I witnessed in my childhood. It turned out that Kevin's scar was caused by the burns of rosin that splashed all over the place back then. Maggie suddenly laughed, with a tearful tone in her laughter. "So you joined forces with the dear spirit to take revenge? Use hallucinogenic spores to make us kill each other?" She staggered and grabbed the edge of the trial table, But you don't know that I'm also a victim. It was Judge Robert who asked my father to start corrective therapy. He said that Anna's matter would affect his campaign for state legislator. The whole place was dead silent. Robert's gavel fell to the ground with a clang, and his face flickered in the candlelight. Maggie, are you crazy?
I'm not crazy. Maggie rushed to Irene and grabbed her wrist, her nails almost digging into her skin. Smell it. There was not only pine resin in the bonfire, but also Robert's cufflinks. She pulled Irene's hand and pressed it on the scar behind her ear. My father's note said that Robert would send pine resin every week, saying that he wanted to purify these indecent girls. Irene's olfactory compensator vibrated violently. She closed her eyes, and the fishy sweetness of the resin suddenly gave way to the cold astringency of metal. It was the silver cufflink that Robert always wore on his left wrist. She had seen it yesterday when he was sorting out the trial materials. That's enough. Robert suddenly stood up straight, his voice no longer steady. Do you think you can convict me based on these speculations? Kevin's photo is fake. Maggie's words are crazy. No, you're faking it. Emily's voice came from behind the crowd. The blonde girl who always huddled in the corner clutched a plastic evidence bag with half a burnt metal buckle in it. I found it under the floor of the old warehouse at the camp. She looked at Robert. After the summer camp ended in 1999, my mom was a camp cleaner. She found this when she was cleaning up the bonfire. She said it was engraved with RH. Robert Hawke, right? Robert's face turned pale instantly. Irene was shocked to realize that she had never asked Robert's full name, and only knew that he called himself Judge. Then Hawke is her mother's maiden name. And this. Kevin opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of yellow telegrams. From July to August 1999, Mr. White sent telegrams to the RH State Senator campaign office every week, saying purification progress 3-5 and the last one has been processed. He turned to Robert. You were the youngest candidate for Colorado at the time, right? Anna Jones's father was your political enemy. So you wanted to make this improper, illegitimate daughter disappear completely. The sound of pine waves suddenly poured into the barn. Irene saw Colin walk up to her and quietly hook his fingers around her little finger, a soothing gesture that only they knew. She took a deep breath, and the fresh scent of pine needles poured in from the window, overpowering the sweet smell of pine resin. Mr. Robert Hawke, her voice was very soft, but it was like a hammer hitting ice. You asked Maggie's father to use corrective therapy to deal with Anna, and you asked Maggie to use the same method to control the later participants. When Anna's brother Lucas came back with hallucinogenic spores for revenge, you realized that Maggie might reveal the truth, so you planned this trial and wanted to kill her with our hands. Is that right? Robert took 2 steps back and knocked over the chair in the witness stand. His Adam's apple moved, and he suddenly grabbed the candlestick on the table and smashed it against the window. Amid the sound of shattering glass, Jack rushed over and held down his shoulders. Lily's trap rope had already wrapped around his ankles. It's Anna's father who wants to expose the affair between me and his wife, Robert suddenly yelled, tears and snot flowing down his face. I just wanted that girl to shut up. Who knew she would run to the bonfire? There were sobbing sounds in the barn. George put his arm around Emily's shoulders while Lily helped Maggie tidy up her messy hair. Colin's fingers were still hooked around Irene's, and the warmth of his palms came through their skin like a small flame. It's over, Erin said softly. She looked out the window. The pine forest was silvery in the moonlight, and the new pine needles were swaying gently in the wind. Those secrets sealed by resin finally melted away in the spring, like snow following this trial. Colin bent down and kissed the top of her head, with a smile in his voice. Now it's time for us to start a new life. Kevin came over and handed Irene the Polaroid album. There was a new photo on the last page. It was the scene of tonight's trial, with everyone standing at the door of the barn, with the whitening sky behind them. There are no dark shadows of deer antlers in the photo, only the rising sun, which makes everyone's shadow very long. Your house is about to close.
but the next puzzle is waiting. If it moves you, please gently like, subscribe, and pass on this piece. Sleep well, dear wanderer.